My name is Jeremiah Crowfeather, and I've been a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains for 14 years. I'm 38 now, half Cherokee, half Irish, and I've seen just about everything these mountains can throw at you. Bears, storms, lost hikers, broken bones, heart attacks, you name it. I've pulled over 200 people out of dangerous situations, and I got a Bronze Star in Vietnam before I came home to work in the place my grandmother always said had magic in it. I never believed the old stories. Cherokee grandmothers love to tell tales about spirits and crying women who steal your soul. I figured they were just ways to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods. Even after all my years out here, listening to every sound these mountains make, I thought I knew what was real and what wasn't. That changed in October of 1977 on Ravens Ridge. It started with 3 teenagers who came down from their campsite looking like they'd seen death itself. Todd Jenkins, Rebecca Walsh, and Mark Rivera, college kids from Knoxville who'd been camping up on the ridge for a week. They stumbled into the ranger station at dawn, shaking and pale. "There's someone up there," Todd said, his voice cracking. "A woman. She's been screaming for help every night at exactly 3:17 a.m. We tried to find her, but what?" I asked, pouring them coffee with hands that had steadied plenty of scared campers before. Rebecca wrapped her arms around herself. "We can't find her during the day. It's like she disappears when the sun comes up. But every night, right at 3:17, she starts screaming, not just calling for help, screaming like someone's killing her." Mark hadn't said a word. He just stared at his coffee cup, his hands shaking so bad he couldn't lift it. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. 7 nights, Todd said. 7 nights of the same thing. We were going to leave yesterday, but our car won't start. It's like something doesn't want us to go. I'd heard plenty of ghost stories from spooked campers, but these kids looked genuinely terrified. And there was something else, something wrong about the way they looked. Their hair seemed grayer than it should be for college kids, and their faces had lines that shouldn't have been there. "I'll head up there today and take a look," I told them. "You kids stay in town tonight." I should have listened to the voice in my head telling me not to go alone, but I'd been handling backcountry rescues for years. I packed my standard search and rescue gear, first aid kit, rope, emergency radio, compass, and flashlight. At the last minute, I grabbed a pouch of Cherokee tobacco from my truck. My grandmother always said tobacco was for respect, for letting the spirits know you came in peace. I didn't think I'd need it. I thought I was just looking for a lost hiker. The trail up to Ravens Ridge is steep, but well marked. I'd been up there dozens of times, but as I climbed higher, something felt different. The forest was too quiet. No bird songs, no rustling leaves, no insects buzzing. Even my boots on the trail seemed muffled, like the mountain was holding its breath. About halfway up, I found their campsite. The tents were still there, but something was wrong. Their campfire had food cooking over it, beans in a pot, hot dogs on sticks, and the food was still warm. Steam was rising from the coffee pot. But the camp was empty, like they'd all just vanished in the middle of making dinner. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" My voice echoed strangely, like it was being swallowed by the trees. No answer came back. That's when I noticed my watch had stopped working. I checked my watch again. The hands were frozen at 3:17. That couldn't be right. The sun was still high in the sky, maybe 4 in the afternoon. I tapped the watch face, wound it, but nothing happened. When I looked up at the sun to guess the real time, something felt wrong about its position too, like it had jumped forward in the sky while I wasn't looking. My radio crackled with static. I tried calling back to base, but all I got was white noise mixed with something that sounded almost like crying. I adjusted the frequency, tried different channels, but the crying sound got louder instead of clearer. "Base, this is Crowfeather. Do you copy?" I said into the radio. The static answered back, and underneath it, I could swear I heard a woman's voice sobbing. I clipped the radio back to my belt and looked around the campsite more carefully. The teenagers' camping gear was all there. Sleeping bags, backpacks, clothes hanging on a line between 2 trees. But there were no signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing broken or torn. It was like they'd all stood up in the middle of eating dinner and walked away. Except for one thing. On the ground near the fire, I found a piece of cloth caught on a thorn bush. It looked old, really old, like something from a museum. The fabric was faded and delicate, like it might crumble if you touched it. But it was the style that caught my attention. It looked like a dress from the 1800s, the kind Cherokee women wore before the soldiers came. When I reached down to pick it up, the cloth turned to dust in my fingers. That's when I heard the first scream. It started soft and far away, like someone calling across a valley. But it got louder fast, building until it felt like it was coming from everywhere at once. It wasn't a call for help. This was pure terror, the kind of sound that comes from someone facing something worse than death. The scream made my teeth ache. It made my bones feel cold. And underneath the fear in that voice, I heard something else. Grief. The deepest, most hopeless sadness I'd ever heard. I grabbed my flashlight and compass, trying to figure out which direction the sound was coming from. But my compass needle was spinning like a top, and never settling on any direction. The screaming seemed to bounce off the trees, coming from north, then south, then right behind me. That's when I saw her. At first, she was just a pale shape at the edge of the trees, maybe 50 yards away. A woman in a long dress, standing perfectly still. I couldn't make out her face, but she was facing me, and I could tell her mouth was open. The screaming was coming from her. "Ma'am," I called out, "are you hurt? I'm a park ranger." She didn't move, didn't stop screaming. But something about the trees around her changed. The branches seemed to bend toward her, like they were being pulled by invisible hands. The shadows under the trees moved wrong, shifting and reaching even though the sun hadn't moved. I started walking toward her, but with each step, the sadness in that scream hit me harder. It wasn't just her grief. It felt like every sad thing that had ever happened was pouring into me all at once. I thought about my squad in Vietnam, about the friends I'd lost. I thought about my grandfather dying when I was 12, about every time I'd failed to save someone in these mountains. By the time I was 30 yards away, I was crying and didn't know why. When I looked up again, she was gone. But the screaming continued for another 10 minutes, fading slowly like an echo that wouldn't die. I found Todd Jenkins at the bottom of the ravine just before sunset. He was lying twisted among the rocks like he'd fallen from the ridge above. But when I climbed down to check on him, I knew something was terribly wrong. Todd had been maybe 20 years old when I'd seen him that morning. The body I found looked like it belonged to a 70-year-old man. His hair was completely white. His skin was wrinkled and spotted with age, and his face was locked in an expression of absolute terror. But the worst part was his eyes. They were still young, still 20 years old and full of fear. My hands shook as I checked for a pulse I knew I wouldn't find. His body was cold, but not from being dead long. It was cold like something had sucked all the warmth out of him. When I tried to radio for a recovery team, that crying sound came through the static again. But this time, mixed in with the crying, I heard Todd's voice. "Help me," it whispered through the radio. "She won't let me go." I turned the radio off and didn't turn it back on. I spent that night in my truck at the bottom of the mountain, but I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Todd's aged face and heard that woman screaming. When 3:17 a.m. came, and somehow I knew it was 3:17 even though my watch was still broken, the screaming started again. But this time it was coming from multiple directions, like there were several women crying out across the mountains. At dawn, I hiked back up to get Todd's body, but I wasn't going alone this time. I brought my Cherokee grandmother's medicine bundle, tobacco, sage, and a small bag of corn pollen. If there was something up there that belonged to the old ways, I needed to approach it with respect. The forest was still too quiet, but now I noticed other things wrong. Trees that should have been green and healthy looked withered on one side, like something had drained the life out of them. Animals had fled the area. No tracks, no droppings, no signs of life except for the scrub pine and mountain grass. I found Rebecca Walsh at their campsite. She was sitting in her sleeping bag, eyes open, perfectly still. From a distance, she looked like she was just watching the sunrise. But when I got closer, I saw she was dead. Like Todd, she'd aged decades in a single night. Her brown hair had turned completely white, and her young face was covered in deep lines. But unlike Todd, she looked peaceful, sad, but peaceful. Her sleeping bag was covered in frost, even though it was October and not that cold. I was checking her pulse, knowing there wouldn't be one, when I heard footsteps behind me. Yusha wouldn't have come back. I spun around, hand going to the bear spray on my belt. But it was just Mark Rivera, the third camper. Except he didn't look like the scared kid I'd met yesterday. He looked older, grayer, and his eyes had a strange, distant look. "Mark? What happened here? Where have you been?" "She showed me," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "She showed me what happened to her family. They were torn apart, taken from each other. The soldiers came and separated the mothers from their children, husbands from their wives. She watched her baby die on the trail." "Who showed you this?" "The crying woman. She's not trying to hurt us. She's trying to share her grief. She's been alone with it for so long, and it's too much for one person to carry." Mark's hair was turning white as he spoke. I could see the lines deepening in his face. "Mark, you need to come with me, right now. We need to get you to a hospital." He shook his head slowly. "It's too late for me, but not for you. She likes you, Jeremiah. She knows your blood, knows your grandmother's stories. She wants to show you the truth about what happened here." "What truth?" "This ridge was where they separated the Cherokee families in 1838. The soldiers lined up the men on one side, women and children on the other. Families were torn apart right here, never to see each other again. She was one of those mothers. She died of grief on the trail, but her spirit came back to this place." The air around us started getting colder. I could see my breath, and frost was forming on the trees. "Her name was Nvi Atsila, the crying woman. She's been alone with her grief for almost 140 years, and now she wants company." That's when the screaming started again, but this time it was right behind me. I turned around and she was there, not 10 feet away. In full daylight, I could see her clearly. She was tall, maybe 7 yards, in feet, with long black hair that moved like it was underwater. Her dress was made of what looked like mist and shadow, constantly shifting and flowing. But her face was human, and it was destroyed by sorrow. Her eyes were holes of black that seemed to pull at something inside me. Her mouth was open in that endless scream, and when she looked at me, I felt her grief hit me like a physical blow. Every loss I'd ever experienced came flooding back. My friends dying in Vietnam, my grandfather's funeral, every time I'd been too late to save someone in the mountains. But more than that, I felt her loss. The child torn from her arms, the husband she'd never see again, the long, cold walk toward Oklahoma where so many died. I understood why Todd and Rebecca had aged so fast. This kind of grief, this deep and pure, could kill you. It could use up all your years in a single night. But I also understood something else. She wasn't evil. She was just the saddest thing that had ever existed, and she'd been carrying that sadness alone for too long. "I see you," I said in Cherokee, the way my grandmother had taught me. "I see your pain." The screaming stopped. For the first time in 140 years, Nvi Atsila was quiet. She spoke to me in Cherokee, her voice like wind through dry leaves. "You carry the old blood. You understand loss." I nodded, my hands shaking as I reached for the tobacco pouch. "I understand. But you can't keep taking people. These kids didn't deserve to die." "Neither did my child," she said, and the sadness in her voice made the trees around us bend and sway. "Neither did my husband. Neither did the hundreds who died on that trail, because we were torn from our homes." Mark was still standing behind me, aging with each passing minute. I could hear his breathing getting shallow, his heart slowing down. "What do you want?" I asked her. "I want someone to remember. I want someone to carry this grief with me so I'm not alone anymore. The white people who come to these mountains, they don't know what happened here. They don't know that this grew to and is sacred, that it's soaked with tears. She moved closer and I felt the temperature drop even more. Ice was forming on my jacket. I can show you everything, she said. Every mother separated from her child, every elder who died from heartbreak, every family destroyed. You can carry it with me. And if I do, then you'll understand, and you'll never be alone with your own losses again. I looked back at Mark. His hair was completely white now, his face deeply lined. He was smiling, but it was the smile of someone who'd given up. Don't listen to her, he whispered. She's not evil, but her grief will kill you. It's too much for any one person. But as I looked at Nvi Atsila, I realized something. She wasn't asking me to die. She was asking me to witness, to remember, to make sure the story didn't disappear. I thought about my grandmother's teachings, about the responsibility we have to honor the dead, to carry their stories forward. This woman, this spirit, she was part of my people's history, the darkest part, but still part of it. There's another way, I said, pulling out the tobacco and sage. In Cherokee tradition, we have ceremonies for grief, ways to honor the dead without being destroyed by sorrow. Her black eyes fixed on me. Show me. I lit the sage with trembling hands, let the smoke rise between us. I sprinkled tobacco on the ground in the 4 directions, the way my grandmother had taught me. I see your loss, Nvi Atsila. I see your child, your husband, your people. I see the injustice done to you. I see your long walk in chains, the families torn apart, the children who died far from home. The wind picked up, carrying the sage smoke around us in a spiral. I see your grief, and I honor it. Your loss was real. Your pain was real. The wrong done to you was real. She was listening, her screaming mouth closed for the first time in over a century. But grief shared is grief lessened. You don't have to carry this alone anymore. Your story will be remembered. The trail of tears will be remembered. Your people's suffering will not be forgotten. I reached into my grandmother's medicine bundle and pulled out a small piece of white quartz, a stone for grieving. Take this to the spirit world, I said, holding it out to her. Let your ancestors know you carried the sorrow as long as you could. Let them carry it now. She looked at the stone, then at me. For just a moment, her face changed. Instead of the grief-destroyed woman, I saw who she had been before. Young, beautiful, full of love for her family. Will you remember? She asked. I'll remember. I'll make sure others remember too. She reached out and took the quartz stone. As soon as it touched her fingers, her appearance began to change. The mist and shadow of her dress became solid cloth. Her black eye sockets filled with warm brown eyes. She looked like a Cherokee woman from long ago, dressed for a journey. Thank you, she said. I can see them now. My child, my husband. They're waiting for me. The sun was rising, and in its light she became transparent. The young man will live, she said, nodding toward Mark. He chose to listen instead of run. That saved him. As she faded away, the forest came alive again. Birds started singing, insects buzzed, and a warm breeze replaced the cold air. The last thing I heard was her voice, peaceful now. Remember us. Then she was gone. Mark collapsed, but he was breathing. His hair was still white, and his face still lined, but the aging had stopped. When the rescue helicopter arrived, my radio worked fine now. The medics said he'd live, though he looked like he'd aged 20 years overnight. The official report listed Todd Jenkins and Rebecca Walsh as victims of exposure and dehydration, tragic hiking accidents. The Park Service didn't want to deal with unexplainable deaths, and honestly, I didn't blame them. But I kept my promise to Nvi Atsila. I couldn't handle backcountry assignments anymore. Very time I went into the deep woods alone, I'd hear echoes of her grief, see shadows that moved wrong. So I took a desk job and started working with the Cherokee Nation to establish a memorial on Ravens Ridge, a place where people could learn about the Trail of Tears, about the families torn apart, about the children who died far from home. The memorial was dedicated in 1979. It's still there, if you want to visit. A simple stone circle with plaques in Cherokee and English, explaining what happened on that ridge in 1838. I retired from the Park Service in 1995, but I still live near the mountains, and I still hear her sometimes, on quiet nights when the news talks about families being separated, children taken from parents, people forced from their homes. Just a whisper of crying on the wind, reminding me that some wounds take generations to heal. The new ranger who took over my old territory, a young guy named Peterson, he's reported strange sounds on Raven's Ridge a few times, always on October nights, always around 3:17 a.m. I told him the story, gave him some sage and tobacco, taught him the words to show respect. He thinks I'm a crazy old man telling ghost stories. Maybe I am, but I know what I saw up there, and I know what I promised. Grief has power in these mountains, and some sorrows run too deep to heal on their own. They need witnesses. They need people who remember. So I remember Nvi Atsila, the crying woman of Raven's Ridge. I remember her child torn from her arms, her husband taken away, her long walk toward death. I remember that this beautiful land we love was built on sorrows that still echo in the wind. And sometimes, on the anniversary of her death, if you listen carefully on Raven's Ridge, you can still hear crying in the distance. Not the desperate scream of a woman in eternal torment, but the quiet weeping of someone who knows her story is remembered, her loss honored, and that she's no longer alone with her grief. The mountains remember everything, and now so do you. My name is Ruth Ironwood, and I've been a forest ranger in Daniel Boone National Forest for 17 years. I've seen plenty of strange things in these Kentucky hills, but nothing prepared me for what happened at Coal Creek Hollow in October of 1983. People ask me why I stayed in this job so long. Truth is, I love these mountains. My great-grandmother was Cherokee, and she always said the hills have their own spirit. I used to think that was just old folk talk. I don't anymore. I specialize in fire suppression and mine safety. That means I know every abandoned mine shaft, every old strip mining scar, every dangerous hole in the ground for 50 miles around. The mining companies tore up these hills pretty bad in the 60s and 70s, then left us to deal with the mess. Sealed mine shafts, toxic runoff, unstable ground, it's all part of my daily routine. Coal Creek Hollow was always one of the quiet places. The mining company pulled out in 1963 after some kind of accident. They sealed up the main shaft with 3 feet of concrete and posted warnings everywhere. For 20 years, nothing bothered that place except the occasional hiker. Then the sound started. It was a Tuesday morning when I got the first call. A couple from Louisville had been camping near the hollow. They called the state police, all worked up about breathing sounds coming from inside the mountain. The dispatcher figured they'd been drinking and asked me to check it out. I drove my truck up the old mining road, past the rusted equipment the company left behind. 20 years of weather had turned the bulldozers and conveyor belts into orange skeletons. The road was barely passable, full of potholes and washouts. The sealed mine entrance sat at the end of the hollow like a concrete tombstone. I'd inspected it dozens of times over the years. The seal was always solid, never showed any cracks or settling. That morning, I could see something was wrong from 50 yards away. The concrete seal had a hole in it, not a small crack or a gap where it had pulled away from the rock. A hole big enough for a person to crawl through with chunks of concrete scattered on the ground like someone had punched it out from the inside. I parked the truck and grabbed my flashlight. The air felt different around the mine entrance, warmer than it should be, with a sweet smell I couldn't place, like flowers that had been rotting in the sun. I called out, thinking maybe some kids had been fooling around with dynamite. "Hello, this is the Forest Service. If anyone's in there, you need to come out right now." Nothing answered back except my own echo. But as I listened, I heard it, a slow, deep breathing sound, like something the size of a whale was sleeping in the mountain. I'd been in enough mines to know what normal air movement sounds like. This wasn't air moving through passages. This was something alive, something big, breathing deep in the darkness. That's when I noticed the claw marks. They were gouged into the solid rock around the entrance, like someone had taken a backhoe bucket and scraped it across stone. But these weren't tool marks. They had the curved shape of claws, each one as long as my arm and deep enough to stick my fist into. The marks all pointed outward, like whatever made them had been trying to get out of the mine, not in. I should have called for backup right then. Should have sealed off the area and brought in a team with proper equipment. Instead, I did what any good ranger does when people might be in danger. I went in alone. The hole in the concrete was just big enough for me to squeeze through. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, showing the main tunnel stretching ahead. The mining company had driven this shaft straight into the mountain for him, nearly a mile, following a coal seam that ran deeper than any other mine in Kentucky. Something was wrong with the tunnel. I'd been in here twice before for safety inspections, and I remembered it being barely wide enough for the mining cars. Now it looked like a subway tunnel. The walls had been scraped smooth and widened, creating a passage big enough to drive a truck through. The breathing sounds got louder as I walked deeper. Not fast breathing like a scared animal, but slow and steady like something that had all the time in the world. The sweet rotting smell got stronger too, mixed with something that burned my nose and made my eyes water. I checked my watch. I'd been walking for 15 minutes when I found Jimmy Caldwell. Jimmy was a local guy who spent his free time looking for old mining equipment to sell for scrap. I'd warned him about unsafe mines before, but he never listened. Now I wished he had. He was lying on his side about 30 feet from the main tunnel in what used to be a storage chamber. At first glance, he looked normal, just sleeping. Then I got closer and saw what the sweet smell was. Jimmy was melting. His clothes were intact, but his skin looked like warm wax. When I touched his shoulder, my finger went right through. His bones were soft as rubber, and there was a clear, sticky fluid all around his body that burned like acid when it touched my glove. I've seen plenty of dead bodies in my time. Hiking accidents, hunting accidents, heart attacks in the woods. This was different. Jimmy hadn't just died. Something had started digesting him while he was still alive. That's when I heard the movement deeper in the mine. It wasn't footsteps or the sound of something walking. It was more like a huge rope being dragged across stone with a wet, sliding quality that made my skin crawl. Whatever was making the breathing sounds was moving around in there. I backed away from Jimmy's body and started making my way toward the entrance. That's when my flashlight beam caught something that made me freeze. Eyes. 2 golden lights, the size of dinner plates, watching me from the darkness ahead. They didn't blink or move, just stared with an intelligence that was definitely not human. When I shifted my flashlight, they reflected the beam back like a cat's eyes, but brighter and more focused. The breathing stopped. The silence was worse than the sound had been. I could feel something huge studying me, deciding what to do next. The air got warmer, and the acid smell got stronger. Whatever was watching me was getting ready to move. I ran. I made it back to the entrance in record time, diving through the hole in the concrete and stumbling to my truck. My radio was crackling with static, but I managed to raise the dispatcher. "This is Ranger Ironwood. I need state police and a hazmat team at Coal Creek Hollow immediately. We have a death and possible toxic contamination." "Copy that, Ruth. What's the nature of the emergency?" I looked back at the mine entrance. The golden eyes were gone, but I could still hear that slow breathing echoing from the hole. "Chemical exposure," I said. It was close enough to the truth. "1 fatality, unknown toxic agent. Area needs to be sealed off until we can identify the hazard." While I waited for backup, I walked the perimeter around the mine entrance. The ground temperature was wrong, at least 20 degrees warmer than it should be. My radiation detector was clicking steadily, showing levels that weren't dangerous but definitely weren't normal. More troubling, every animal in the hollow was gone. No birds, no squirrels, no insects. Even the trees closest to the mine looked sick, with brown leaves and bare branches despite it being October. Whatever was in that mine had been changing things, making the whole area into something that didn't belong in Kentucky. The state police arrived 2 hours later, followed by an EPA team and the county coroner. I walked them through what I'd found, leaving out the details about golden eyes and breathing sounds. Officially, this was a toxic waste investigation. Dr. Maria Santos from the EPA took one look at Jimmy's body and called for full contamination protocols. She'd never seen anything like the chemical burns on his remains. The tissue samples she collected were so degraded, they looked more like soup than human flesh. "What kind of industrial chemicals were they storing in here?" she asked me as we stood outside the entrance. According to the records, nothing. This was a straight coal extraction operation. They used some explosives for blasting, but nothing that would cause this kind of damage. Dr. Santos was thorough and careful. She was also the second person to die. They found her body 3 days later, about 200 yards from the mine entrance. She'd been working late, taking soil samples in the dark. Unlike Jimmy, her body hadn't been dissolved. Instead, she'd been crystallized. Her entire body had turned into some kind of mineral deposit, like a life-sized statue made of pale green crystal. Her face was frozen in an expression of terror, mouth open in a scream that would never end. The crystallization had happened fast enough that she was still holding her sample containers. That's when the state decided to bring in Robert Hayes, a mine safety inspector with 30 years of experience in hazardous site remediation. His job was to figure out what was in the mine and seal it permanently. Robert was a good man, careful and professional. He brought proper equipment, sealed suits, breathing apparatus, gas monitors, the works. He was going to do this right. I tried to warn him about the breathing sounds and the eyes, but he thought I was suffering from stress reaction after finding Jimmy's body. Can't say I blamed him. If someone had told me the same story, I probably wouldn't have believed it either. Robert went into the mine on a Thursday morning with enough equipment to handle any known toxic hazard. His radio worked fine for the first hour. He reported normal air quality in the main tunnel and confirmed that the passage had been significantly widened since the original construction. Then the radio went dead. We gave him 2 hours before sending in a search team. They found his equipment about halfway down the main tunnel: breathing apparatus, protective suit, detection instruments, all neatly arranged in a line like someone had unpacked a suitcase. They never found Robert. What they did find were more claw marks, fresh ones that scraped deep gouges in the tunnel walls, and they found acid burns in the rock, like something corrosive had been splashed against the stone in large quantities. The search team also reported that the tunnel system had changed again. New passages had opened up, leading deeper into the mountain. The original mine shaft had only gone down about 1,000 feet. Now there were chambers and corridors that stretched much further into the earth. That evening, I got a visit from Joseph Crow Feather, an elderly Cherokee man who lived on a small reservation about 50 miles south. He'd heard about the deaths and driven up to see the site for himself. "You know what you're dealing with?" he asked me as we stood looking at the mine entrance. "Some kind of chemical contamination. Maybe radioactive material the mining company left behind." Joseph shook his head. "This is Uch-10, the horned serpent, guardian of the deep places." He told me stories I'd heard as a child from my great-grandmother. Ancient tales about giant serpents that lived in caves and underground rivers, protecting mineral wealth from those who would disturb it. Most Cherokee avoided certain places in the mountains, places where Uch-10 was said to dwell. The mining company dug too deep in 1963, Joseph said. They broke into the serpent's lair and woke it up. Then they sealed it in, trapped it underground. Now it's angry. I wanted to dismiss his words as superstition, but I couldn't forget those golden eyes watching me from the darkness. That night, the creature made its first appearance above ground. I was camped near the hollow, keeping watch on the site when the ground started to vibrate. At first I thought it was an earthquake, but the movement was too regular, too rhythmic, like footsteps, but from something massive walking underground. The vibrations got stronger, and then the earth started cracking open near the mine entrance. Not little cracks, but fissures wide enough to swallow a car. Something was pushing up from below, forcing its way to the surface. That's when I saw it. The thing that emerged from the largest crack was nothing like anything in any biology textbook. It was serpentine, covered in scales that shifted color from black to deep green in the moonlight. But this wasn't just a big snake. It was easily 200 feet long and thick as a subway car, with a head the size of a pickup truck. The head was the worst part. It had the basic shape of a snake, but with ridges of bone above the eyes that looked almost like horns. The eyes themselves were those same golden orbs I'd seen in the mine, but now I could see the intelligence behind them. This thing was smart, maybe smarter than I was. It also had teeth. Lots of them, in multiple rows like a shark, each one as long as a knife blade. When it opened its mouth, I could see deep into its throat, and the air that came out burned my lungs and made my eyes water. The creature pulled itself fully out of the crack and coiled in the moonlight, raising its head 30 feet above the ground. It looked around the hollow like a homeowner checking their property, then fixed those golden eyes directly on me. When it spoke, I felt the words as much as heard them. The voice came up through the ground, making the earth vibrate under my feet. "I was here before your kind knew fire," it said. The words were in English, but they carried echoes of other languages, older tongues that humans had forgotten. "I have guarded these depths for longer than your mountains have stood." I should have run. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get in the truck and drive away as fast as possible. But something my great-grandmother had taught me held me in place. "When the old powers speak to you," she'd said, "you listen respectfully." "I'm sorry," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I didn't know anyone was down there. The mining company should have never disturbed your home." The great head tilted, studying me. "You speak truth. Most of your kind take without asking, destroy without thought. But you understand the old ways. My great-grandmother was Cherokee. She taught me to respect the spirits of the land." "Cherokee." The creature's voice carried a note of satisfaction. Yes, they remembered the agreements. They knew to offer tobacco and corn, to ask permission before taking from the deep places. They knew to leave the guardian chambers untouched. The serpent lowered its head until it was only a few feet from me. Up close, I could see that its scales weren't just black and green. They had patterns etched into them, like ancient writing or carved symbols. The acid smell was stronger now, making my nose burn. For 20 years, I have been trapped in those narrow tunnels, unable to return to my deep chambers, unable to hunt in the underground rivers. The rock closers sealed me in their mine, thinking they could contain what they did not understand. "What do you want?" I asked. "Freedom. Passage to the deep places where I belong. But your kind fears what they do not understand. They will come with fire and poison, trying to destroy what cannot be destroyed. More will die unless we make an agreement." I thought about Jimmy Caldwell dissolving in the mine, about Dr. Santos turned to crystal, about Robert Hayes who had simply disappeared. This creature had killed 3 people, but from its perspective, they had been intruders in its home. "What kind of agreement?" The serpent's eyes brightened. "I will go deep, to places your kind cannot follow. I will trouble your surface world no more, but the old agreements must be remembered. Offerings must be made. Respect must be shown." "And if I can't make that happen?" The creature's mouth opened slightly, showing those rows of terrible teeth. "Then I will make my own way to freedom. Your people will not survive what I must do." I believed it. This thing had been playing nice so far, staying mostly underground, only killing people who came into its territory. If it decided to come to the surface permanently, it could devastate the entire region. "I'll need time," I said. "I'll have to convince people, make arrangements." Time. The serpent seemed to taste the word. "Your kind always needs time." "Very well. But know this, little guardian. Others are coming. I can smell them on the wind. They carry weapons and flame. If they force me to defend myself, our agreement ends." As if summoned by the creature's words, I heard the sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. The military was coming, probably with enough firepower to level the mountain if necessary. The serpent heard them too. Its head swung toward the sound, and for a moment I saw something that terrified me more than its size or teeth. I saw anger. "Choose quickly," it hissed, and slipped back into the crack in the earth. The ground sealed itself behind the creature, as if it had never been disturbed. I had maybe an hour before the military arrived in force. 1 hour to figure out how to relocate a 200-foot serpent that could melt people with its breath and turn them into crystal statues. I called Joseph Crowfeather. "You were right about Uke-10," I told him. "It wants to make a deal, but the army's coming. We need to do this fast." Joseph arrived 40 minutes later with 3 other Cherokee elders and a pouch of sacred tobacco. They weren't surprised when I told them about my conversation with the creature. In their tradition, the old spirit Sumpta, Im spoke directly to humans when the need was great. The ritual was simple but powerful. The elders formed a circle around the largest crack in the ground and began chanting in Cherokee. They sprinkled tobacco and cornmeal into the opening, making offerings the way their ancestors had for centuries. The serpent emerged slowly, keeping its massive body coiled in the crack, but raising its head to receive the offerings. When the elders spoke to it in the old language, it responded with sounds that seemed to come from deep in the earth. I don't know what they said to each other, but after 20 minutes of back and forth, the creature looked directly at me. "It is agreed," it said in English. "I will go to the deep places, far from your surface dwellings. But you, little guardian, must ensure the old ways are remembered. When your people dig in the deep places, they must ask permission. They must leave offerings. They must know that some chambers are sacred and must not be disturbed." "I promise," I said, and meant it. The serpent nodded once, then began to withdraw into the earth. As it disappeared, the crack sealed itself, leaving only normal forest floor behind. The warm air and acid smell faded, replaced by the clean scent of pine trees and mountain air. Joseph Crowfeather handed me a small pouch. "Tobacco," he said, "for the quarterly offerings. And Ruth, this is just one creature in one mountain. There are others, deeper places that your people have not yet found. Remember that." The military arrived 3 hours later to find a perfectly normal mine site with no signs of unusual activity. The official report blamed the deaths on exposure to unknown toxic chemicals left behind by the mining company. The site was permanently sealed and declared off-limits to civilian access. I never told them about the serpent or the agreement we'd made. Some truths are too important to trust to government reports. That was 41 years ago. I retired from the Forest Service in 1995, but I still make the quarterly visits to Coal Creek Hollow. I leave tobacco and cornmeal at the sealed mine entrance, and I maintain relationships with the Cherokee elders who help monitor spiritual activity in the mountains. The creature has kept its word. There have been no more mysterious deaths, no more acid burns or crystallized bodies. The deep places stay quiet as long as people remember to show proper respect. But sometimes, late at night, I get calls from rangers in other parts of the forest. They report strange sounds from old mine shafts, unexplained warm spots in the ground, or equipment that shows radiation signatures with no apparent source. When that happens, I pack my truck with tobacco and cornmeal, and I go have a conversation with whatever has been disturbed. Because Joseph Crowfeather was right. Uke-10 wasn't the only guardian in these mountains. The Cherokee knew something that we've forgotten in our rush to dig and blast and extract. The earth is alive, and it has been watching us longer than we've been watching it. Most of the time, it's content to let us live on the surface, taking what we need to survive. But some places are sacred. Some chambers are meant to stay sealed, and some things that live in the deep places are better left undisturbed. Strip mining scarred these hills, but what came out of Coal Creek was older than any mine, and it's still down there, waiting in the deep places, patient as stone and twice as dangerous. The earth remembers everything. It's time we started remembering too. My name is Samuel Thornfield, and I've been a ranger in the George Washington National Forest for 12 years now. I know these mountains better than most folks know their own backyard. Every trail, every creek, every spot where hunters like to set up camp. My dad was English, my mom German, and both taught me to pay attention to details. That skill kept me alive in the military police, and it's kept me safe out here too. until 1985. That was the year everything changed. October in Virginia is beautiful. The leaves turn colors that look like God spilled paint across the mountains. The air gets crisp, and hunters start coming out for deer season. I've seen it all before. The weekend warriors who get lost 50 yards from their trucks, the old-timers who know what they're doing, and the families who've been hunting these woods for generations. But hunting season in '85 was different. Something was hunting back. I should mention, I'm not one for tall tales. I've heard all the local stories about the wampus cat, some kind of creature the Cherokee used to talk about. 6 legs, walks on 2 sometimes, mean as a rattlesnake. Most rangers just roll their eyes at that stuff. Mountain folklore, we figured. Stories old-timers tell to explain why hunters sometimes don't come home. The first sign something was wrong came on a Tuesday. Jake Morrison, one of the best hunters in 3 counties, was supposed to check in by radio at 6 p.m. Jake had been hunting these mountains since he was 12. His daddy taught him, and his daddy's daddy before that. Jake didn't get lost. Jake didn't forget to check in. When 8 p.m. rolled around with no word, I grabbed my gear and headed out to his usual spot up on Ridge Trail. The October air was getting cold fast, and my breath made little clouds as I hiked. I found Jake's camp just after dark, and right away I knew something was very wrong. His tees. Ent was still set up. His rifle was leaning against a tree. His dinner was half-eaten on a paper plate, beans still on the spoon. But Jake was gone. I called his name until my voice went hoarse. Nothing but my own echo coming back from the mountains. The next morning I found tracks around his camp. Big cat tracks, but wrong somehow. Mountain lions live in these woods, sure, but these prints were huge. And they had something mountain lion tracks don't have. What looked like thumbs. Long marks in the dirt where claws had dug in, but shaped like a person's hand. I followed the tracks for about a quarter mile before they just stopped. Not like the animal walked away. The prints just ended in the middle of a clearing, like whatever made them had vanished into thin air. That's when I started to worry that maybe those old Cherokee stories weren't just stories after all. 3 days after Jake went missing, 2 more hunting parties failed to return. The Peterson brothers, who'd been hunting together for 20 years, and Ellen Rodriguez, a bow hunter who could track a deer through a thunderstorm. All experienced. All people who knew better than to take stupid risks. I found the Peterson camp first. Same thing as Jake's. Food left half-eaten, gear abandoned, no sign of struggle. But this time, I found something else. Scratched into the bark of an old oak tree, about 8 feet up, were claw marks. Deep ones, like something had climbed straight up the trunk and gouged the wood with knives. Ellen's camp was different. Worse. Her bow was snapped in half, arrows scattered everywhere. Her backpack was torn open and the contents spread around like something had been searching through it. And hanging from a low branch, swaying in the breeze, was one of her boots. Empty, just dangling there like some kind of sick joke. But the worst part was the sound I heard while I was searching Len's camp. A woman's voice calling for help from somewhere deeper in the woods. High and scared, echoing off the trees. I grabbed my radio and my service weapon and followed the voice. "Help me," it called. "Please, someone help me." I crashed through the underbrush, following the sound, my heart pounding. The voice led me in circles for 20 minutes, always just ahead, always just out of sight. Finally, I stopped running and really listened. The voice was too clear, too perfect. It never got tired or out of breath, even though it had been calling for help for 20 minutes straight. And there was something else underneath it, a low rumbling sound, like a big cat purring. That's when I realized the voice wasn't human at all. I backed away slowly, my hand on my gun, trying not to make any noise. The fake woman's voice called a few more times, then stopped. The woods went dead quiet. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then I heard it, a sound I'll never forget as long as I live. It started as a woman screaming, high and terrified. But it changed, deepened, became the yowl of something huge and angry. The sound echoed through the trees and seemed to go on forever. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I ran all the way back to my truck and didn't stop until I was back at the ranger station. But even there, with electric lights and radio contact and other people around, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the tree line. That night I called Martha Crowfeather, an elder from the Cherokee Nation who lived about 30 miles south. Martha knew more about these mountains than anyone alive. If strange things were happening, she might have answers. "Samuel," she said when I described what I'd found, "you need to listen to me very carefully. You're dealing with something we call Iwa. Your people might know it as the Wampus cat. It's not just an animal. It's not just a spirit. It's something in between. Martha, I need facts, not—" "This is a fact," she cut me off. "Iwa can look like a person when it wants to. It can sound like one, too. It hunts when the harvest moon is strong, and it's smarter than any human. It knows things about you that you never told anyone." I wanted to argue, but I couldn't forget that voice in the woods. Too perfect, too human, and completely wrong. "How do I stop it?" I asked. There was a long pause. "You don't," Martha said finally. "You survive it." The next morning, I found Jake Morrison, or what was left of him. He was 20 feet up in a pine tree, wedged between branches like he'd been thrown there. Jake was a big man, maybe 200 pounds, but something had tossed him up there like he was a rag doll. The claw marks on his body were massive, 4 parallel gashes across his chest and back. Whatever killed him had claws like kitchen knives. But the really sick part was how he'd been positioned. His body was arranged just so, facing down toward the trail where other hunters would be sure to see him. Like a warning, like something was marking its territory. I called it in, but before the coroner arrived, I took pictures and measurements. The claw marks were 7 inches long and went deep into the bone. The medical examiner would later say Jake died from blood loss, but I knew better. Jake died from fear first. You could see it in his eyes. 2 days later, we found Ellen Rodriguez. She was laid out in a clearing like she was sleeping, except she was missing most of her left side. Something had taken bites out of her like she was a sandwich, but again, the body was positioned deliberately. This wasn't random killing. This was a message. Tom Bradley disappeared next. Tom was a hunting guide who'd been working these mountains for 15 years. He knew to be careful. He carried a radio, checked in every 2 hours, never hunted alone. Didn't matter. We found Tom hanging upside down from a tree branch, gutted like a deer. His rifle was, as on the ground below him, still loaded. Whatever got Tom, he never had a chance to fire a shot. That's when I knew we were dealing with something that thought like a human, but wasn't one. The attacks were getting bolder, too. Hunters started reporting equipment failures, rifles jamming at crucial moments, tree stands collapsing, GPS units going haywire, compasses spun in circles. Cell phones died even with full batteries. Carl Hoffman was guiding a group of 5 hunters from Richmond when it happened. Carl had been in these woods longer than I'd been alive. He could read tracks like some people read books. When his group got spooked by something moving in the brush, Carl did everything right. He kept them together, moved them toward the main trail, radioed for pickup. They made it maybe half a mile before something took Carl. The other hunters said they heard him scream, but when they looked back, he was just gone. They found pieces of his clothes hanging from tree branches for the next quarter mile, like something had torn him apart while running. The survivors described what they saw, and their stories all matched. Something huge moving through the trees, too fast to get a clear look. Sometimes on 4 legs, sometimes on 2. Yellowish fur and the biggest claws they'd ever seen. But the worst part was the face. When they caught glimpses of it, the face looked human, female, almost pretty if you didn't notice the teeth. That's when I decided to see it for myself. I set up a trail camera near Tom Bradley's body, figuring whatever killed him might come back to check on its work. 3 nights later, I got pictures that made my blood run cold. The first few shots showed nothing unusual. Woods at night, caught in the camera's flash. Then, in the 4th picture, a pair of yellow eyes reflecting the light from about 50 yards away. The 5th picture showed something moving closer. The 6th showed a shape that my brain couldn't quite process. It was crouched on 4 legs, but the body was wrong. Too long, too muscular. The fur was yellowish-brown like a mountain lion, but the head was huge, And in the seventh picture, the thing was standing upright like a person, 8 feet tall, human female torso and face, but covered in fur. Arms too long, ending in claws that looked like they could tear through steel. And the expression on that almost human face, it was smiling, like it knew I was watching. The last picture showed the creature walking toward the camera, not stalking, just walking, calm as you please. The timestamp showed these pictures were taken over 30 seconds. In the final shot, those yellow eyes were looking straight into the camera lens. The next morning, I found the trail camera torn apart and scattered across half an acre. I should have left well enough alone. Should have called in the National Guard and let someone else deal with it. But Susan Wright was still out there somewhere. Susan was a kindergarten teacher from Harrisonburg who came up to hunt with her father every October. Sweet kid, maybe 25, and she'd been missing for 2 days. I found her on a Tuesday morning, and it broke something inside me that I'm not sure ever got fixed. Susan was laid out in a perfect circle of stones, arms crossed over her chest like she was sleeping. But she was pale as snow, drained of blood, with 2 neat puncture wounds in her neck. Around her body, someone or something had arranged her gear in patterns that looked almost like writing. Her rifle, her backpack, her boots, all positioned just so. This wasn't just killing anymore. This was ritual. That night, I stayed in the woods. I know it was stupid, but I was angry. Mad enough to do something crazy. I set up camp right in the middle of where all the attacks had happened, and waited. The harvest moon was 3 days away from full, and I could feel something building in the air. The animals had all gone quiet. Even the insects stopped making noise. As like the whole forest was holding its breath. Around midnight, I heard them coming. Not one creature, multiple sets of footsteps moving through the trees, circling my camp. Sometimes the footsteps sounded human. Sometimes they sounded like big cats. But they were coordinated, working together, and they were getting closer. "Samuel," a voice called from the darkness. A woman's voice, sweet and worried. "Samuel, are you all right? We've been looking for you." It sounded like Ellen Rodriguez. Ellen, who I'd found half-eaten 3 weeks ago. "Samuel," another voice called. This one sounded like Jake Morrison. "Come on out, buddy. Let's go home." More voices joined in. Tom Bradley, Carl Hoffman, Susan Wright, all the missing hunters, calling my name, trying to lure me away from my fire and into the darkness. But I could hear the purring underneath their words. I kept my rifle ready and my back to the fire. The voices kept calling, kept trying to sound concerned and friendly. They knew things they shouldn't know, details about my life, names of people I cared about, fears I'd never told anyone. Then, just as the voices were starting to sound angry, Martha Crow Feather stepped into the firelight. She was carrying an old rifle that looked like it belonged in a museum, and she wasn't alone. 3 Cherokee men followed her, all armed with weapons I'd never seen before. Bows with arrows that seemed to glow in the moonlight, and blades that caught the fire like they were made of silver. "You did a brave thing, Samuel," Martha said quietly, "but also a stupid thing. Tonight the moon is almost full. Tonight they're at their strongest." The fake voices from the darkness stopped calling. The woods went completely silent. "How many?" I whispered. "Family group," one of Martha's companions said. "Mother, father, 2 cubs. They've been hunting together for generations." That's when they showed themselves. 4 shapes stepped out of the tree line, just at the edge of my firelight. They moved like cats, but stood like people. The largest one, the mother, was close to 9 feet tall when she reared up on her hind legs. Her face was almost human, almost beautiful, but the teeth were all wrong. Too many, too sharp. "You've been in our territory," the mother thing said, and her voice was perfect English. No accent, no animal growl. She could have been a news anchor. "You've interfered with our hunt." "This is our land too," Martha said, stepping forward. "We had an agreement." The creature that looked like a father laughed, and the sound made my skin crawl. That agreement was made with your great-great-grandparents, old woman. The world has changed. Some things don't change, Martha replied, and raised her rifle. The battle lasted maybe 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. The creatures moved faster than anything had a right to move, phasing in and out of the firelight like smoke. Sometimes they looked like giant cats, sometimes they looked human, sometimes they looked like something in between. The Cherokee men fought them with weapons that seemed to hurt the creatures when regular bullets couldn't. Silver arrows that burst into flames when they hit fur. Blades that cut through what looked like solid muscle but turned out to be shadow. I emptied my rifle twice and never hit anything. The creatures were too fast, too smart. They knew exactly where I was going to shoot before I pulled the trigger. But Martha and her men knew what they were doing. This wasn't their first time fighting these things. When it was over, 2 of the creatures lay dead by my fire. The other 2 had vanished back into the darkness, but I could hear them calling from the tree line. Not in human voices anymore, but in sounds of grief and rage that echoed through the mountains. "It's done," Martha said, lowering her rifle. "For now." The official report said rabid mountain lions. 6 deaths over 3 weeks, all attributed to a family of diseased animals that had to be put down. The National Guard came in and did a sweep of the area, found nothing, and declared the problem solved. But I knew better, and so did Martha. We worked out a new arrangement. The Cherokee Nation would monitor the deep woods during harvest moon season. I would keep hunters away from certain areas without telling them exactly why. And every October, when the moon got full and the leaves started to change, we'd both watch the mountains a little more carefully. I never saw the creatures again, but I knew they were still out there. Sometimes, late at night, I'd get reports of strange sounds from deep in the forest, voices calling for help that sounded too perfect to be real, hunters who swore they saw human faces in the darkness, watching them from the trees. I learned to pay attention to the Cherokee warnings. They knew things about these mountains that Forest Service manuals don't teach. They understood that some hunts are older than human civilization, and some prey fights back. I kept working as a ranger for another 15 years before I retired. I trained my replacement carefully, made sure he understood that certain areas were off limits during Harvest Moon Week. I never told him exactly why, but I made sure he knew to trust Martha Crow Feather if she ever called with warnings. The missing hunters were never found. Their families got closure reports about rabid mountain lion attacks, insurance payouts, and memorial services. But sometimes, on quiet October nights when the moon is full, I still hear their voices calling from the deep woods, not asking for help anymore, warning other hunters to stay away. I'm retired now, living in a small house at the edge of town. But every October I still drive up to the mountains and park at the trailhead. I sit in my truck with a thermos of coffee and Martha's number programmed into my phone, and I watch the tree line. Because some things never really end. They just wait for the right season to come around again. The harvest moon will be full again next week. And somewhere in those mountains, something is getting ready to hunt. My name is Samuel Thornfield, and I know these mountains better than most folks know their own backyard. I know which trails are safe and which ones aren't. I know when to pay attention to the old Cherokee stories, and I know that some hunts never end. They just change hunters. If you're planning to go hunting in the George Washington National Forest this October, do yourself a favor. Stay close to the main trails. Check in regularly. And if you hear a voice calling for help from the deep woods, a voice that sounds too perfect, too human, too concerned, don't follow it. Just turn around and walk away. Trust me on this one. My name is Isaiah Blackwater, and I've been a park ranger at Cumberland Gap for 16 years now. That's long enough to know every trail, every cave, and every ghost story these mountains hold. What I'm about to tell you happened in the fall of 1979, and I swear on my grandmother's grave that every word is true. People always ask about my last name, Blackwater. It's Melungeon, which means I'm part of one of the oldest mixed-blood families in these mountains. My people have been here since before anyone kept records, a blend of Cherokee, European, and something else nobody likes to talk about. We've always been different, always kept to ourselves, always had secrets. I was 44 then, with a PhD in Appalachian history and enough book learning to make me think I was smart. I specialized in Melungeon culture, spoke 4 languages, and gave tours to college kids who came looking for their roots. I thought I knew everything about my people. I thought our old family stories were just that, stories. The trouble started when Dr. Patricia Moore brought her archaeological team to dig up what they called a significant Melungeon settlement near Pinnacle Overlook. Patricia was a good woman, excited about her work, always asking me questions about burial customs and old family traditions. She had federal permits and university backing, so I helped however I could. Isaiah, she said that first morning, walking me around the marked-off dig site, this could be the find that finally answers questions about Melungeon origins. The preliminary surveys show structures and burial patterns unlike anything we've documented. I should have listened to the feeling in my gut that day. The air felt wrong somehow, too thick, too quiet. Even the birds seemed nervous, flitting from tree to tree without landing. But I pushed those thoughts away. I was a man of science and education, not superstition. The dig team was small but enthusiastic. Patricia, her graduate student Rick Thompson, site supervisor Janet Williams, and a federal investigator named Mark Stevens, who was there to oversee anything they might find. They set up their equipment and started the careful work of uncovering the past. That first week, everything seemed normal. They found pottery shards, old tools, the usual things you'd expect from a 19th century mountain settlement. But then they started finding the bones. The first skeleton came up on a Tuesday morning. Patricia called me over, her voice tight with excitement and confusion. "Look at this burial pattern," she said, kneeling beside the carefully exposed remains. "The body's positioned in a way I've never seen before. And these markings on the bones..." I crouched down beside her and felt my blood turn cold. Carved into the leg bones were symbols I recognized from my grandmother's stories. Symbols she said should never be disturbed, never even drawn in the dirt. They looked like twisted trees with roots that spelled out words in a language that hurt to look at. "Dr. Moore," I said carefully, "maybe we should cover this back up. Call the tribal council, get permission before we go further." She laughed, not unkindly. "Isaiah, you know as well as I do that proper Melungeon tribal structure dissolved generations ago. This is too important for superstition." But it wasn't superstition making my hands shake as I stared at those bone carvings. It was memory. My grandmother's voice on dark nights, telling me about the old agreements, the prices paid, the things that watched our bloodline from the shadows. I should have grabbed a shovel and buried that skeleton myself. Should have driven everyone off that mountain and never looked back. Instead, I helped them dig deeper. By the end of that first week, they'd uncovered 12 coves, complete skeletons, all carved with the same impossible symbols, all buried in the same twisted pattern that formed a shape I didn't want to recognize. And that's when the carbon dating results came back. Patricia called me at home on a Sunday evening, her voice high and strained. "Isaiah, we've got a problem. These bones, they're from different time periods. Some date to 1820, others to 1870, some to 1920. But Isaiah, they were all buried at the same time. The soil layers prove it. How is that possible?" I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen staring at nothing, while my grandmother's words echoed in my head. The Melungeon people kept secrets in these mountains, boy, and some secrets keep themselves. The first death happened on a Monday morning. I got the call at 5:47 a.m. Janet Williams had found Patricia's body at the dig site. I drove up there faster than I should have, my Ranger truck sliding on the morning dew. Janet was sitting on a folding chair, wrapped in a blanket, staring at nothing. Her face was white as paper. "She's over there," Janet whispered, pointing toward the main excavation pit. "I came early to check the equipment. She was just lying there." Patricia Moore was sprawled across the ancient burial pattern, her body positioned exactly like the skeletons they'd been digging up. But what made my blood freeze wasn't the position. It was her skin. She was completely drained of blood, pale as moonlight, and carved into her arms were the same symbols we'd found on the bones. The local sheriff, Deputy Hayes, showed up 20 minutes later. He took one look at the body and called for backup. "Looks like some kind of ritual killing," he said, crouching beside Patricia's body. "These cuts are precise, done with something real sharp. You know anyone around here who might be into this kind of thing?" I didn't answer. I was staring at the symbols on Patricia's arms, and for just a moment, they seemed to move, twisting like living things under her skin. "We need to close this site down," I said. "Get everyone away from here." "Now, ho!" held on Isaiah, Janet said, standing up shakily. "We can't just abandon months of work because of one tragic incident. Patricia would want us to continue." But Rick Thompson, Patricia's graduate student, was backing away from the dig site with wide, frightened eyes. "Those symbols," he whispered. "They weren't carved after she died. I can see where the blood pooled. Someone carved them while she was still alive." That's when I noticed the other thing wrong. The skeletons we'd carefully excavated and laid out for study. They'd been moved, not scattered or disturbed, but repositioned into a new pattern, a pattern that formed a perfect circle around where Patricia's body lay. "Nobody touched those bones," Janet said firmly when I pointed it out. "I locked the site myself last night. The chain-link fence is still intact, the gate still padlocked." But the bones had moved. And deep in the woods around us, I could swear I heard something breathing. We closed the site that day while the sheriff investigated. The official cause of death was listed as homicide by person or persons unknown. But I knew better. I spent that evening calling every surviving Melungeon family I could think of, asking about the old stories, the old warnings. My great-aunt Willa, 93 years old and sharp as a blade, finally told me what I needed to know. "Boy, you stirred up something that was meant to stay sleeping," she said over the crackling phone line. "That burial ground wasn't made to honor the dead. It was made to keep something locked away. And now you've gone and opened the door." "What kind of something, Aunt Willa?" "The kind of something our ancestors made a deal with, long before your great-great-grandfather was born. The kind of something that's been watching over our bloodline ever since, keeping our secrets, protecting us from people who dig too deep." The next morning, Rick Thompson didn't show up for the reopening of the investigation. Janet found him in his motel room, and when I got there, I wished I hadn't. Rick was sitting upright in bed, eyes wide open. But he looked like he'd aged 50 years overnight. His brown hair had turned completely white, and his skin was wrinkled and spotted like an old man's. The motel room was ice cold despite the heater running full blast. "Heart failure," the coroner said later, "sometimes happens to young people under extreme stress." But I saw the look of absolute terror frozen on Rick's face. I saw the symbols carved into the wooden headboard behind him, the same symbols from the bones, the same ones that had been cut into Patricia's skin. And I saw the message written in what looked like frost on the motel room mirror. "Blood remembers." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw shadow figures moving through the trees around my house. When I went to check the windows, there was nothing there, but I could feel eyes watching from the darkness. At 3 a.m., my phone rang. "Isaiah?" It was Janet, and she was whispering. "Something's happening at the dig site. I can see lights moving around up there, but nobody's supposed to be there. Can you meet me?" Against every instinct screaming in my head, I agreed. The drive up to Pinnacle Overlook felt like driving into a nightmare. The trees seemed to lean over the road, and my headlights caught glimpses of movement in the woods. Too tall to be deer, too quick to be human. Janet was waiting by her car, flashlight in hand, but she wasn't alone. Standing around the excavation site were figures made of shadow and mist, translucent but clearly there. They moved like people, but wrong somehow, as if they remembered how to walk but had forgotten why. And they were all looking at me. "They showed up about an hour ago," Janet whispered. "They're not doing anything, just watching." As I approached the dig site, the shadow figures turned to follow my movement, and in the pale moonlight I could see their faces, or what had once been was, in faces. Melungeon features, familiar bone structure, eyes that held recognition. "They're my people," I breathed. These are my ancestors. One of the shadow figures stepped forward, and when it spoke, the voice came from everywhere at once. Blood calls to blood, Isaiah Blackwater. You have awakened what should stay sleeping. You have brought strangers to sacred ground. Janet grabbed my arm. Isaiah, what's it talking about? How does it know your name? The shadow figure raised one misty arm and pointed directly at me. The bargain must be honored. The secrets must be kept. The price must be paid. That's when Janet Williams screamed. Janet's scream cut through the night like a knife, but it wasn't fear that made her cry out. It was pain. Blood was running down her neck where something had clawed her, 3 parallel scratches that hadn't been there a second before. The shadow figures were moving now, circling us like wolves. I could see more of them emerging from the woods, dozens of transparent shapes with Melungeon faces I almost recognized. They moved without sound, but the air around them felt heavy and cold. The protection was broken, the lead figure said in that voice that came from everywhere. Strangers came seeking secrets that are not theirs to know. The guardian spirits must act. I grabbed Janet's arm and pulled her toward her car. We need to leave, now. But Janet was staring at the shadow figures with wide eyes, not moving. This is incredible, she whispered. I'm seeing actual spiritual manifestations. This could revolutionize our understanding of... Her words were cut off as invisible claws raked across her back, shredding her jacket and leaving deep scratches in her skin. Janet, move! I shoved her toward the car as the shadow figures began to close in. We ran, crashing through the underbrush, while behind us came sounds like wind through dead leaves. If wind could be angry and hungry. We made it to Janet's car, but when she tried to start it, nothing happened. The engine was completely dead. Use the radio, I said. Call for Tier. Back up. Janet grabbed the radio mic, but only static came through. The shadow figures were surrounding the car now, pressing close to the windows. Up close, I could see the family resemblances. This one had my grandfather's nose, that one had my grandmother's chin. They were my people, but they were also something else now. One of them placed a misty hand on the passenger window where I sat. The glass began to frost over, and words appeared in the ice. Protect the blood. Keep the secrets. What secrets? I asked out loud. What are you protecting? The lead figure stepped through the car door like it wasn't there, its form becoming more solid as it entered the vehicle. Janet couldn't see it, but I felt the temperature drop 20 degrees. Melungeon people are not what the world believes, it said. We are not merely mixed blood from known peoples. We carry the blood of something older, something that came from beyond the mountains, beyond the world the white man knows. Images flashed in my mind. Not quite memories, but inherited knowledge flowing through my bloodline. I saw my ancestors making contact with beings that came from cracks in reality. Creatures that offered gifts in exchange for secrecy and protection. I saw the first Melungeons transforming, gaining abilities that helped them survive in these harsh mountains. We carry their blood, the figure continued, and they still watch over their descendants. When strangers threaten to expose what we truly are, we must act. The car engine suddenly roared to life, but I wasn't touching the keys. Janet looked at me with desperate eyes. Drive, I said. Drive fast. We made it back to town, but Janet wouldn't stop talking about what she'd seen. She was a scientist, she said. This was the discovery of a lifetime. She had to document it, study it, share it with the world. I tried to explain that some things we weren't meant to be shared, but she wouldn't listen. She started making calls to universities, to television producers, to anyone who would pay attention to her story about guardian spirits and supernatural manifestations. 3 days later, Mark Stevens, the federal investigator, was found dead. They discovered his body in the woods near the dig site, buried up to his neck in the exact spot where we'd found the first skeleton. He'd been buried alive, dirt packed so tight around him that he couldn't move or call for help. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that his position in the ground completed the pattern. 12 ancient skeletons plus one fresh body formed a perfect 13-pointed star around the central excavation pit. Deputy Hayes called me to the scene because I was the cultural expert, he said. I needed to help him understand what kind of ritual killings they were dealing with. But when I got there, I could see more than Hayes could. The shadow figures were still present, standing at each point of the star pattern, keeping watch. And written in the dirt around Mark's body were symbols that spelled out a message in the old language my grandmother had taught me. The 13th guardian is chosen. This is getting out of hand, Hayes said, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold October air. 3 people dead in a week, all connected to this dig. I'm calling for federal backup. No, I said quickly. Don't bring more people here. It'll only make things worse. But Hayes had already made up his mind. By evening, he'd contacted the FBI. By the next morning, agents were swarming the mountain. Agent Lisa Crawford was young, smart, and completely unprepared for what she was walking into. She arrived with a team of forensic specialists and a truck full of equipment to collect evidence. She wanted to take samples of everything: soil, bones, even scrapings from the carved symbols. Mr. Blackwater, she said, shaking my hand with a firm grip, I understand you're the local expert on the people who created this site. I'll need you to walk me through everything you know about their burial customs and spiritual beliefs. I tried to warn her, tried to explain that some places were meant to be left alone, that taking evidence from this particular site would only lead to more death. But she had orders from Washington. The unusual circumstances and multiple deaths had made this a federal case. That afternoon, as Agent Crawford's team started collecting bone samples and photographing the symbols, the shadow figures became agitated. I could see them pacing at the edges of the dig site, their forms becoming darker and more solid with each passing hour. And that night, Agent Crawford joined the list of the dead. They found her body the next morning, positioned at the exact center of the 13-pointed star. Her throat had been torn open by claws that left marks too large to be from any known animal. But what made me sick to my stomach was the look of understanding on her face. Like in her final moments, she'd finally grasped what she was dealing with. Clutched in her hand was a bone fragment she'd tried to take as evidence. The fragment had crumbled to dust overnight, leaving only a handful of gray powder that blew away in the morning breeze. Deputy Hayes was the next to die. He was found in his patrol car on the access road, aged to death like Rick Thompson had been. His radio was still on, and dispatch said his last transmission was just him repeating, "I understand now," over and over until his voice gave out. That's when I realized the shadow figures weren't just killing randomly. They were working through a list, eliminating everyone who had gained dangerous knowledge about the dig site, and I was probably next. But when I drove up to the site that evening, the lead shadow figure was waiting for me with a different message. "You are blood of our blood," it said. "You carry the true heritage. We do not hunt you. We offer you a choice." The shadow figure stepped closer, and I could see through its translucent form to the ancient burial site beyond. But now I could also see the truth that had been hidden for generations. The bones weren't just Melungeon ancestors. They were the remains of people who had been changed by contact with something from beyond our world. And the symbols carved into them weren't just marks. They were a kind of writing that hurt to look at, because human eyes weren't meant to process that particular reality. "Your people made a bargain long ago," the figure said, its voice now speaking directly into my mind. "We gave them the strength to survive in these mountains, the wisdom to hide from those who would destroy them, the blood that would protect them through generations. In return, they agreed to keep our existence secret." Images flooded my consciousness, my ancestors meeting with beings that stepped out of cracks in the air, creatures of shadow and light that offered gifts beyond human understanding. I saw the first Melungeon settlements thriving in places where others failed, protected by guardians that watched from the spaces between trees. But the modern world grows curious, the figure continued. Scientists dig where they should not dig. Governments seek what they should not find. The time of secrets is ending, and we must decide. Do we fade away, or do we choose a new guardian? "What happened to the others?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "They learned too much. They would have exposed us to a world that would seek to capture, study, and destroy what it does not understand. We eliminated the threat." "And what about me?" The shadow figure extended one misty hand toward me. "You are the 13th, Isaiah Blackwater, The pattern is complete. Accept your role as guardian, and we will give you the power to protect this, a secret. Refuse, and you will join the others in the earth. I looked around at the dig site, at the bones arranged in their ritual pattern, at the shadows of my ancestors waiting for my answer. Part of me wanted to run, to drive down the mountain and never look back. But another part of me, the part that had always felt different, always known I carried something strange in my blood, was curious about what they were offering. What would I become? I asked. What you were always meant to be, what all true Melungeons are, beneath the human surface. The shadow figure reached out and touched my forehead, and suddenly I could see everything. I saw the truth about my people, that we weren't just mixed blood from European and Native American sources. We carried DNA from something else, something that had crossed over from a parallel dimension centuries ago. That's why our genetics had always confused scientists, why we'd never quite fit into any standard racial categories. I saw the guardians that had protected Melungeon communities for generations, invisible spirits that dealt with threats before they could expose our supernatural heritage. And I saw what would happen if that protection disappeared. Government laboratories, scientific experiments, my people hunted and captured like specimens. The choice must be made now, the figure said. More investigators are coming. More scientists who will dig deeper, ask harder questions, take samples that cannot be destroyed by normal means. We need a guardian who can walk in both worlds, human enough to understand their methods, but changed enough to stop them. I thought about Patricia Moore, lying dead with symbols carved in her skin. About Rick Thompson, aged to death in a motel room. About all the others who had died because they'd gotten too close to a truth that was never meant for the outside world. If I agree, I said, will the killing stop? The killing will stop when the threat stops. With you as guardian, threats can be managed more subtly. Around me, the shadow figures were growing more so, more real. I could feel power radiating from them, ancient alien power that sang in my blood like a half-remembered song. What do I have to do? The lead figure smiled, and for the first time I could see it clearly. It was my great-great-grandfather, the man my grandmother had told me stories about, the man who had first made contact with the beings from beyond. Walk into the center of the pattern, he said. Let the transformation begin. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking. Each step toward the center of the 13-pointed star felt like walking deeper into a dream. The shadow figures moved aside as I passed, but I could feel their approval radiating through the cold night air. At the center of the pattern, where Agent Crawford's body had been found, the ground was soft and dark. As I stepped onto it, symbols began to glow beneath my feet. Not the carved symbols from the bones, but living light that pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. Are you ready, Isaiah Blackwater? My ancestor asked. I thought about my normal life as a park ranger, giving tours to tourists and filing reports about trail conditions. I thought about my small house, my quiet evenings, my simple routine. All of that would be over after tonight. But I also thought about my people, the Melungeon families scattered through these mountains, and what would happen to them if their supernatural heritage was exposed to the world. I'm ready, I said. The light beneath my feet exploded upward, engulfing me in cold fire that burned without heat. I felt my body changing, my DNA rewriting itself, my consciousness expanding to touch dimensions I'd never imagined existed. And in that moment of transformation, I understood everything. The shadow figures weren't ghosts. They were guardians who had undergone the same change I was experiencing now. The Melungeon people weren't just mixed blood. They were the descendants of an interdimensional migration that had happened centuries ago. And I wasn't just becoming a protector of secrets. I was becoming something that was no longer entirely human. When the light faded, I was still standing in the center of the pattern, but the world looked different. I could see energy patterns in the air, hear conversations happening miles away, feel the life force of every creature in the mountains around me. The shadow figures were gone, but I knew they weren't really gone. They were part of me now, their knowledge and power flowing through my transformed blood. and I could feel the next threat already approaching, a team of government scientists with equipment designed to detect supernatural phenomena, scheduled to arrive within the week. It was time to get to work. The official report listed the Cumberland Gap incident as a series of tragic accidents caused by unstable geological conditions and natural gas seepage from abandoned mine shafts. 5 deaths were attributed to asphyxiation, 1 to a rockfall, and 1 to what was delicately termed wildlife attack. All physical evidence from the archaeological dig mysteriously deteriorated within days of the site being sealed. Bone samples crumbled to dust. Photographs became too blurred to make out details. Even the carved symbols seemed to fade from memory. Witnesses could remember seeing them, but couldn't describe what they looked like. The dig site itself was declared geologically unstable and permanently closed to the public. A rockslide conveniently buried the excavation area under tons of stone, and the access road was rerouted away from Pinnacle Overlook. I returned to my job as a park ranger, filing the same reports, giving the same tours, maintaining the same quiet routine I'd always had. To anyone watching, nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I could feel the presence of other guardians now. Melungeon descendants who had undergone the transformation in previous generations, scattered through communities across Appalachia. We formed a loose network of protection, sharing information through means that had nothing to do with phones or computers. When researchers got too interested in Melungeon genetics, their samples would be contaminated. When historians dug too deep into our origins, their sources would become unreliable. When government agencies asked too many questions, their investigations would be quietly redirected toward more conventional mysteries. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes I had to visit people in their dreams, implanting suggestions that steered them away from dangerous knowledge. Sometimes I had to arrange small accidents that destroyed evidence or discredited witnesses. And occasionally, very rarely, I had to make more permanent interventions. But the killing sprees were over. With living guardians managing the threats, the shadow spirits could rest peacefully in whatever dimension they inhabited when they weren't protecting our people. 6 months after the dig, I got a visit from my great-aunt Willa. She came to my house on a cold February evening, moving more spryly than any 93-year-old should. "I can see the change in you, boy," she said, settling into my kitchen chair like she owned the place. "You carry the guardian mark now." I poured her coffee and sat down across from her. "How long have you known about what we really are?" She laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Known? Child, I've been a guardian for 72 years, been keeping our secret since before your daddy was born." That's when I realized the network was larger than I'd imagined. Older, more organized. Melungeon guardians had been protecting our people's supernatural heritage for centuries, evolving their methods as the world changed around them. "The young ones always think they're the first," Aunt Willa said, reading my expression. "But the bloodline has been calling its own since the first crossing. We just let you think you're making the choice yourself." "And if I'd refused?" She sipped her coffee and smiled. "Boy, you've got guardian blood running through your veins." Refusing was never really an option. Over the following months, I learned the full scope of what I'd become part of. There were dozens of us scattered through the mountains, ordinary people living ordinary lives while secretly protecting one of the world's best-kept secrets. Teachers who influenced curriculum to steer students away from certain research topics. Doctors who made sure genetic testing never revealed our true ancestry. Government workers who buried reports and misfiled documents. We were the invisible guardians of an invisible people, and we were very, very good at what we did. Sometimes, on quiet nights at the ranger station, I'd feel the presence of the shadow figures moving through the trees around Cumberland Gap. Not threatening now, just watching. Keeping vigil over the sealed burial site and the secrets it contained. And sometimes tourists would ask me about Melungeon history, wanting to know about the mysterious mountain people with no clear origins. I'd tell them the accepted stories, mixed European and Native American heritage, early settlers who kept to themselves, communities that gradually assimilated into mainstream society. I never told them the truth, that the Melungeon people were still here, still watching, still protecting secrets that were older than human history. that some bloodlines carry more than genetics. They carry responsibilities that span dimensions. The mountains keep their secrets well, and those of us who guard those secrets have learned to keep them even better. But every now and then, on foggy October nights when the veil between worlds grows thin, I stand at Pinnacle Overlook and listen to voices speaking in languages that predate human speech, reminding me that some things are too important to ever let the outside world discover. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again, and some guardians never really get to rest. My name is Ezra Grimwood, and I've been a forest ranger for 13 years. I know every trail, every tree, and every dangerous plant in Jefferson National Forest. People think being a ranger is just about putting out campfires and giving directions, but I have a PhD in botany. I can tell you which berries will kill you and which mushrooms will make you sick just by looking at them. Blackberry Mountain had always felt wrong to me. Not scary wrong, just off somehow. The trees grew too close together. Animals avoided certain spots for no reason. Even in summer, some places stayed cold and dark. But in July of 1981, wrong became deadly. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning. A family of hikers had called in a report that made no sense. They said they'd found a perfect circle in the forest where everything was dead. Not burned, not cut down, just dead. Every tree, every bush, every blade of grass had turned black and withered overnight. Must be some kind of disease, my supervisor said, handing me the report. Take a look and write it up. I drove up the mountain road, past the old wooden signs warning about bear country and poison ivy. The summer air was thick and humid, full of buzzing insects and bird songs. Everything seemed normal until I reached the spot the hikers had described. I've seen plenty of plant diseases in my time, fungus that kills oak trees, beetles that destroy pine forests, even acid rain damage, but I'd never seen anything like this. The dead zone was a perfect circle, maybe 30 feet across. Inside it, every living thing had turned black and crumbled. The ground was covered in ash-like dust that used to be plants. Outside the circle, everything was green and healthy. There was no gradual change, no border area, just a sharp line between life and death. I knelt down and touched the dust with my finger. It felt cold, even in the hot summer sun. When I tried to take samples, the dead material crumbled away to nothing. I'd brought my camera and took pictures from every angle, but I knew no one would believe it. Walking around the circle's edge, I noticed something else strange. The healthy plants just outside the dead zone were growing bigger and thicker than normal. The blackberry bushes had thorns twice their usual size. The leaves on poison ivy plants were darker and more oily looking than I'd ever seen. I was so focused on the plants that I almost missed the smell. It hit me gradually. A sweet, rotten scent like flowers left too long in water. But under that was something else, something that made my skin crawl and my hands shake. It smelled like a funeral home. I spent 3 more hours taking notes and measurements, trying to find some scientific explanation. Maybe a gas leak had killed the plants. Maybe someone had dumped chemicals. But the perfect circle shape made no sense. Nature doesn't work in straight lines and perfect shapes. As I was packing up my equipment, I heard something that made me stop cold. It was humming, a woman's voice, low and musical, coming from deeper in the forest. The tune was old, something my grandmother might have sung while working in her garden. I called out, "Hello?" But the humming stopped. The forest went completely quiet. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees. Just silence so complete it hurt my ears. I got out of there fast. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that perfect circle of death and the smell of rotting flowers. I pulled out my old botany textbooks and research papers, looking for any disease that could kill plants so completely and so quickly. I found nothing that matched what I'd seen. The second call came 3 days later. Another dead circle. This one bigger, maybe 50 feet across. But this time, there was a body. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had been my friend since college. She was a plant expert like me, but she specialized in rare and endangered species. The Park Service had called her in to look at some unusual wildflowers that had been spotted near Blackberry Mountain. I found her at the center of the dead zone. Sarah looked like she'd been dead for weeks, but the hikers who found her said they'd seen her alive just yesterday. Her body was dried out like an old leather bag. Her skin was brown and cracked, and her clothes hung loose like they were 3 sizes too big. But the worst part was her hands. They were stained green up to her wrists, like she'd been digging in plants with her bare hands, and clutched in her fingers were stems and roots I didn't recognize. Plants that seemed to twist and writhe even though there was no wind. The county coroner showed up an hour after I did. Doc Henley had been doing autopsies for 20 years. But he took one look at Sarah and stepped back like he'd been slapped. "What in God's name happened to her?" he whispered. "I don't know," I said, but that wasn't exactly true. I was starting to have ideas, and they scared me more than I wanted to admit. We bagged Sarah's body and the strange plants she'd been holding. Doc Henley said he'd do the autopsy the next day, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't want to touch her. After everyone left, I stayed behind to examine the new dead circle. Like the first one, it was perfectly round with a sharp border between death and life. But this one was different. The healthy plants around the edge weren't just bigger. They were moving. I'm not talking about swaying in the breeze. These plants were actively reaching toward the dead zone like they were trying to get closer to whatever had killed everything inside the circle. Vines stretched out further than they should have been able to reach. Tree branches bent down at impossible angles, and the thorns, Jesus, the thorns were everywhere. Every bush, every weed, every plant that could grow them had sprouted thorns the size of my thumb. I were black and shiny, and when I got too close, I swear they turned to point at me. I was taking notes when I heard the humming again. This time it was closer, maybe 50 yards away through the trees. The same old tune, but now I could make out some words. Blackberry, sweetberry, growing on the hill. Blackberry, darkberry, bend them to my will. My skin went cold. I knew that song. My grandmother had sung it when I was little, back when she tended her herb garden behind the old house. But Grandma had been dead for 15 years. I followed the sound through the trees, pushing past the overgrown thorny bushes that seemed to grab at my clothes. The humming got clearer as I got closer, and I could hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, like someone walking carefully through the underbrush. I reached a small clearing and stopped. An old woman was there, bent over a patch of plants I'd never seen before. She was collecting leaves and roots in a wicker basket, moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. She was dressed in clothes that looked like they came from another century. A long dark dress, a faded apron, and a bonnet that hid most of her face. Her hands were stained the same green color as Sarah's had been. "Excuse me," I called out. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area." She looked up, and I saw her face clearly for the first time. She was old, really old, with skin like tree bark and eyes so pale they were almost white. But she moved like a young woman, quick and sure. "Restricted?" she said, and her voice was like dry leaves rustling. "Boy, I've been walking these mountains since before your grandpappy was born." Something about her voice made my stomach drop. It was the same voice I'd heard humming, but now that I could see her clearly, I realized something impossible. Her lips weren't moving when she spoke. "Who are you?" asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She smiled, showing teeth that were too sharp and too yellow. "Folks around here used to call me Granny Blackthorn, but most folks who knew me are dead now." She turned back to her plant gathering, and I noticed that every plant she touched immediately grew bigger and darker. Innocent-looking flowers turned into something twisted and wrong. Harmless weeds sprouted thorns and oily leaves. "What happened to Dr. Mitchell?" I demanded. Granny Blackthorn looked up again, and this time her pale eyes seemed to look right through me. "Poor little thing got curious about the wrong plants. Some knowledge comes with a price, Ranger boy." She stood up, and even though she was small and bent with age, something about her made me want to run. The plants around her feet were writhing now, reaching up toward her like pets begging for attention. "You best stay away from my mountain," she said, "lest you want to end up like your friend." I blinked, and she was gone, just vanished like smoke, leaving only the smell of rotting flowers and the sound of my own heart pounding. I ran back to my truck and didn't stop until I reached the ranger station. That night, Doc Henley called with Sarah's autopsy results. "Ezra," he said, and his voice was shaking, "I don't know how to put this in a report. Your friend didn't die from any disease I've ever seen. Her body was drained, like something sucked all the life right out of her. And those plants she was holding, they're not in any textbook I can find. They don't match any known species." He paused, and I could hear papers rustling on his end. "There's something else. Her stomach was full of plant matter, leaves, berries, roots. But here's the thing, Ezra. Those plants were still alive inside her, still growing." After Sarah's death, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined the old woman. Maybe stress and grief had made me see things that weren't there. But then Tom Bradley died, and I couldn't pretend anymore. Tom was an experienced hiker who knew these mountains almost as well as I did. He'd been coming to Blackberry Mountain for years, always careful, always prepared. His wife found his body on the trail, just 2 miles from the parking area. Like Sarah, Tom looked like he'd been dead for weeks instead of hours. But Tom's death was worse. His face was twisted in pain, and his hands were clawed like he'd been trying to scratch something off his skin. Most horrible of all, there were plants growing out of his mouth and nose, long green vines with tiny white flowers that smelled sickeningly sweet. Doc Henley didn't even try to explain this one. He just marked the cause of death as unknown and asked me to keep the details quiet. People would panic, he said, and I don't blame them. I started patrolling the mountain every day, looking for more dead zones and warning hikers to stay away from certain areas. But the dead circles kept appearing, and they were getting bigger. I counted 5 of them now, arranged in a pattern I was starting to recognize. Late one evening, I spread out a map of the mountain and marked each dead zone with a red X. When I connected the dots, my blood went cold. The 5 circles formed a perfect pentagram, a 5-pointed star with the largest circle at the top point. That night, I went to the local library and dug through old newspapers and historical records. What I found made me wish I'd never gotten curious. The Blackberry Mountain killings weren't new. In 1931, 7 people had died on the mountain from mysterious plant poisoning. In 1881, it was 9 people. The newspaper accounts were eerily similar. Healthy people found dead in the forest, their bodies dried out and twisted, surrounded by strange plants that no botanist could identify. But the oldest record I found was the most disturbing. In 1731, according to a church ledger from the valley below, a woman named Margaret Blackthorne had been tried and executed for witchcraft. The charges included consorting with devil plants and cursing the mountain to steal Christian souls. The ledger said she'd been burned alive, along with her husband and 2 children. Her last words, recorded by the preacher who condemned her, were a promise that she'd return every 50 years to collect what was owed to her. I did the math. 1731, 1781, 1831, 1881, 1931, and now 1981. The next morning, I found Linda Chen. Linda was a young mother from Richmond who'd come to the mountain with her 8-year-old daughter, Lucy, for a weekend camping trip. I found Linda at their campsite, dead in her sleeping bag. Her daughter was alive but unconscious, lying next to her mother's body. Linda's death was the most disturbing yet. Her mouth and throat were stained purple-black, and the smell of bitter almonds hung around her body. But Linda was a smart woman, a nurse who would never eat unknown berries. Yet her stomach was full of deadly nightshade, enough to kill a horse. Little Lucy woke up in the hospital 3 days later. When I went to visit her, she told me something that made my hands shake. "The old lady came to our tent," Lucy whispered. "She was singing that pretty song about berries. She told Mommy the purple ones were good to eat, like candy. Mommy said no, but then her eyes got funny and she ate them anyway." "What did the old lady look like?" I asked. "Really old, with a dirty dress and a basket. She smelled like dead flowers. She tried to give me berries too, but she stopped and looked at me real strange. Then she said something about innocent blood and walked away. Lucy started crying then, and I left her with the nurses. But her words stuck with me. The witch had tried to kill the child, but couldn't do it. Maybe there were rules to this curse, limits to what Granny Blackthorn could and couldn't do. That gave me hope. But it didn't last long. Mark Rodriguez died that same week. Mark was a Forest Service worker, a good man with 2 kids of his own. I found his body wrapped in thorny vines so thick I had to use bolt cutters to set him free. The vines had grown through his clothes and into his skin, and even after he was dead, they kept growing. The attacks were getting bolder, more violent. Whatever was happening on Blackberry Mountain was building towards something bigger. I started carrying my grandfather's old hunting rifle when I patrolled. I didn't know if bullets would stop a 300-year-old witch, but they made me feel better. I also carried a field guide to poisonous plants and a first aid kit loaded with every antidote I could find. On Friday night, I was checking the eastern slope when I heard screaming from the campground below. I ran toward the sound, crashing through bushes and jumping over fallen logs. The screaming stopped before I got there, but I could smell smoke. The Wright family's campsite was a nightmare. John and Mary Wright lay in their tent, their faces blue and swollen. But they hadn't died from poison. They'd suffocated. The air around their tent was thick with yellowish spores that made my eyes water and my throat burn. I held my breath and dragged their bodies outside, then went back for 8-year-old Lucy Wright. She was still alive, but barely breathing. I gave her mouth-to-mouth and carried her to my truck, driving like a maniac to get her to the hospital. Lucy survived, but just barely. The doctors said another few minutes, and she would have died from the toxic spores. Like the other Lucy, this little girl had been spared at the last moment. That night, I sat in my cabin and tried to make sense of it all. 7 people dead in 2 weeks. A 300-year-old witch who could control plants and poison people from a distance. Dead zones arranged in a pentagram pattern across the mountain. And tomorrow was the anniversary of Margaret Blackthorn's execution, July 31st, 1731. Exactly 250 years ago. I had a feeling the killing wasn't over. In fact, I was pretty sure it was just getting started. On July 31st, I went up the mountain alone. I left a letter for my supervisor explaining everything I'd learned about Margaret Blackthorn and the 50-year cycle of deaths. I figured if I didn't come back, at least someone would know the truth. The morning air felt different, thicker, like breathing through wet cloth. The birds weren't singing, and I didn't see any squirrels or chipmunks. Even the insects seemed to have fled the mountain. I hiked to the largest dead zone, the one at the top point of the pentagram. It had grown since my last visit. Now it was nearly 100 feet across, and the smell of rotting flowers was so strong it made me dizzy. At the center of the circle, someone had built an altar out of stacked stones. On top of it was a collection of plants I recognized from my botany studies, all of them deadly. Poison hemlock, death caps, mushrooms, castor beans, foxglove, and dozens of others. But these plants were wrong somehow, bigger and more potent looking than any I'd seen in textbooks. "You came," said a voice behind me. I spun around, rifle ready, but Granny Blackthorn was just standing there like she'd been waiting for me. In the daylight, she looked even more impossible. Ancient, but strong, her pale eyes sharp and intelligent. "I've been watching you, Ranger Boy," she said. "You're smarter than the others. You figured out who I am and why I'm here." "Margaret Blackthorn," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Tried and executed for witchcraft in 1731. She smiled that terrible, sharp-toothed smile. "They burned me alive, along with my husband Daniel and my babies, little Thomas and Mary. Called me a witch because I knew which plants could heal and which could harm." The plants around her were moving now, vines and branches reaching toward her like they were drawn by a magnet. Even the grass under her feet grew taller and darker. "I was a healer," she continued, her voice getting louder and angrier. I helped deliver babies, treated fevers, eased the pain of the dying, but when crop fall, lures and sickness came to the valley. They needed someone to blame. So you cursed the mountain, I said. I cursed the people who murdered my family, she screamed, and every plant within 50 feet suddenly grew 3 times larger. Every 50 years I take 7 lives, the number of years my Daniel lived. It's justice, Ranger Boy, payment for what they stole from me. I looked around at the overgrown, twisted plants and the altar of poisons. This isn't justice. You're killing innocent people. Innocent? She laughed, and the sound made the hair on my neck stand up. Like my children were innocent? Like Daniel was innocent when they put the rope around his neck? Those people are dead, I said. The ones who killed your family have been gone for 200 years. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Confusion, maybe even sadness. But then her expression hardened again. Their descendants remain. Their kind remains. People who fear what they don't understand, who destroy what they can't control. She raised her hand, and I felt a strange compulsion to walk toward the altar. My legs started moving on their own, and I had to fight to stay where I was. You'll be the 7th, she said. Then I can rest for another 50 years. What about the children? I asked desperately. Lucy Chen, Lucy Wright, you spared them. Why? Granny Blackthorn's hand wavered, and the compulsion weakened. Children. Children are different. They haven't learned to hate yet. They haven't chosen sides. That was when I understood. Margaret Blackthorn wasn't just a vengeful spirit. She was a mother who'd lost her babies. Somewhere inside the monster, the woman who'd once healed the sick was still there. I slowly reached into my backpack and pulled out something I'd brought from my grandmother's old garden, a bundle of healing herbs tied with white ribbon. Chamomile, lavender, mint, and willow bark. Plants that eased pain and brought comfort. I know what they did to you was wrong, I said, holding out the herb bundle. I know you were trying to help. People. Not hurt them. But this isn't helping anyone. She stared at the herbs, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked uncertain. You're not like the others, she said quietly. You understand plants. You respect their power. My grandmother taught me, I said. She was a healer too, in her own way. She grew herbs and made teas for anyone who was sick. People called her the plant lady. Granny Blackthorn took a step closer, and I could see tears in her pale eyes. They called me that too, before everything went wrong. It doesn't have to stay wrong, I said. You could stop this. You could choose to heal instead of harm. She was quiet for a long time, looking at the herb bundle in my hands. Around us, the twisted plants began to settle and shrink back to normal size. 250 years of anger, she whispered. How do I let go of that? One choice at a time, I said, starting now. Just then I heard voices coming up the trail, State Trooper James Murphy and 2 other officers. They'd come looking for me after finding my letter. Granny Blackthorn heard them too, and her face twisted with rage. More of them. More who would burn healers and call it justice. The compulsion hit me again, stronger this time. I felt myself walking toward the altar, unable to stop. Behind me, I could hear the officers shouting as they got caught in the same supernatural pull. Please, I said, fighting against the invisible force. Not all people are evil. Some of us are trying to do better. She hesitated, and I managed to take the herb bundle and place it on the stone altar next to her collection of poisons. Choose, I said. Healing or harming? Life or death? For a moment that felt like forever, Margaret Blackthorn stared at the 2 collections of plants, her altar of death next to my small bundle of healing herbs. Then she reached out and pushed the chamomile flowers with one finger. Where she touched them, they grew brighter and more beautiful, filled with gentle power instead of twisted poison. The compulsion broke. Around the dead circle, green shoots began pushing up through the black ash. The change happened slowly at first, then all at once. As Margaret Blackthorne held my grandmother's healing herbs, the plants throughout the dead zone began to transform. The twisted, poisonous growths shrank and softened. Thorns became flower buds. Toxic leaves turned green and healthy. "I remember," she whispered, her voice fading like an echo. "I remember why I loved them. The plants. They were never meant to harm." State Trooper Murphy and his officers stopped their forward march, suddenly free of the supernatural compulsion that had been pulling them toward the altar. They looked around in confusion, hands on their weapons, but not sure what they were supposed to be fighting. "What the hell is going on here, Grimwood?" Murphy called out. I looked back at him, then at the spot where Granny Blackthorne had been standing. She was becoming transparent, like morning mist in sunlight. But her eyes were different now. Not pale and cold, but warm brown like fresh earth. "I'm sorry," she said, though I don't think the others could hear her. "I let the pain make me forget who I really was. Thank you for reminding me." She looked down at the herbs in her hands, then up at me one last time. "Take care of them," she said. "All of them. The plants, the people, the mountain. They need someone who understands." Then she was gone, leaving only the smell of lavender and mint on the summer breeze. The officers spent 2 hours questioning me about what they'd experienced. But how do you explain something like that? In the end, I stuck to the official story we'd been using. Gas leaks from old mining operations had caused hallucinations and accidental poisonings. They didn't believe it, but they didn't have a better explanation. Over the next few weeks, the mountain began to heal. The dead zones filled in with new growth. Normal, healthy plants that didn't try to grab at passers-by or grow overnight into monsters. The 5 circles where people had died became some of the most beautiful spots on the mountain, filled with wild flowers and singing birds. Doc Henley never did figure out what had really killed those 7 people. The official cause of death for all of them remained accidental plant poisoning due to misidentification. It was close enough to the truth, I figured. I found Sarah Mitchell's research notes in her motel room, and they revealed that she'd been investigating reports of impossible plant growth on Blackberry Mountain for months. Her botanical samples, the ones that had seemed so alien and twisted, gradually changed back into normal specimens. But I kept them anyway, locked in a special case in my office, as a reminder. 6 months after everything ended, I planted a small memorial garden near the spot where Margaret Blackthorne's altar had stood. I used only healing plants, the same herbs my grandmother had grown, and others I'd researched from old Appalachian folk medicine traditions. Chamomile for peace, lavender for healing, mint for protection, willow bark for easing pain. I didn't put up any sign or marker. But sometimes hikers stop there to rest, and they always comment on how peaceful the spot feels, how the flowers seem to bloom brighter and last longer than anywhere else on the mountain. I never saw Granny Blackthorne again, but I know she's still there in a way. Not as the angry, twisted spirit who killed 7 people, but as the healer she'd originally been. Sometimes when I'm walking the trails alone, I catch a whiff of chamomile or hear humming on the wind. The same old song, but gentler now, more like a lullaby than a curse. The mountain feels right again. Animals have returned to the areas that used to frighten them. Hikers report feeling refreshed and peaceful after visiting Blackberry Mountain instead of uneasy and watched. But I'm more careful now about the stories people tell around here, the old tales of mountain witches and plant magic. I've learned that most legends start with truth, and that fear and ignorance can turn healers into monsters if we're not careful. I've also started teaching wilderness safety classes with a special focus on plant identification. I figure if people understand what they're looking at, which plants heal and which ones harm, maybe we can prevent future tragedies. Knowledge instead of fear, understanding instead of suspicion. Because the real horror of Blackberry Mountain wasn't the supernatural curse or the vengeful spirit. It was how easily good people can be turned into monsters when we let fear override compassion, when we destroy what we don't understand instead of trying to learn from it. Margaret Blackthorne had been a healer who became a killer because people feared her knowledge and murdered her family. But in the end, she remembered who she really was. She chose healing over harming, life over death. I think about that choice every day now. We all have that same power, to heal or to harm, to help or to hurt. The plants taught me that. So did a 300-year-old witch who just needed someone to remember that she'd once been good. The mountain is quiet now, peaceful in a way it hasn't been for centuries. But I'll keep watching, keep protecting, keep teaching, because somewhere out there are other Margaret Blackthorns, people with knowledge and power who might be pushed too far by fear and ignorance. And if that day comes, I want to be ready with healing herbs instead of torches, with understanding instead of accusations. Sometimes the best way to fight monsters is to remember that they used to be human too. My name is Caleb Stormcrow, and I've been a forest ranger for 20 years. That's long enough to know when something's wrong in the woods, long enough to tell the difference between a bear knocking over trash cans and something that shouldn't exist. They called it Devil's Backbone for good reason. The ridge ran like a giant spine across the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia, all jagged rocks and steep drops. Most folks stayed away from it. Smart folks, anyway. I'm half Cherokee, half Scottish, which my dad used to say made me stubborn as a mule and twice as likely to see things others couldn't. The Cherokee side came from my grandmother, who told me stories about the old spirits that lived in these mountains. The Scottish side came from my grandfather, who taught me that every legend has some truth in it. At 47, I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. Rock slides, flash floods, lost hikers, the occasional black bear with an attitude problem. I had a geology degree from West Virginia University and 20 years of mountain rescue under my belt. I believed in facts, rock formations, weather patterns, things you could measure and explain. I didn't believe in monsters sleeping under mountains. Not until the earthquake started. It began in early October 1976. Small trembles at first, barely enough to rattle the windows in the ranger station. The strange part was where they were happening. Devil's Backbone isn't supposed to have earthquakes. The geology's all wrong for it. No fault lines, no underground water systems that could shift. Just solid rock going down for miles. But the seismograph didn't lie. Every few days, another tremor would ripple through the ridge, always at night, always lasting exactly 37 seconds, and always moving in the same direction, like something huge was turning over in its sleep deep underground. The government boys showed up after the fifth earthquake. Geologists with fancy equipment and serious faces. They set up camp at the base of Devil's Backbone, drilling test holes and taking measurements. Their leader was Dr. James Patterson, a thin man with thick glasses who kept muttering about impossible readings. "The vibrations," he told me one afternoon, wiping sweat from his forehead. "They're not coming from tectonic activity. They're too regular, too organic." I asked him what he meant by organic. "Like breathing," he said, then laughed nervously. "Ridiculous, I know. But that's what the patterns look like. Something breathing very, very slowly." That night, the biggest earthquake yet hit Devil's Backbone. It lasted 2 minutes instead of 37 seconds. And when it was over, something had changed on the ridge. A crack had opened in the rock face, wide enough for a man to walk through. Dr. Patterson was excited. He called it a perfect opportunity to study the geological structure from inside the mountain. He gathered his team and their equipment, planning to go in the next morning. I offered to guide them. These were my mountains, and I knew every trail, every cave, every dangerous spot. But something about that crack bothered me. The edges were too smooth, too clean, like the mountain had opened itself up on purpose. My grandmother's voice whispered in the back of my mind, telling me old stories about Uktena Usti, the great horned serpent that slept beneath the mountains. Stories I'd dismissed as superstition for 47 years. But that night, lying in my cabin with the windows rattling from small aftershocks, I started to wonder if maybe some legends were warnings instead of just stories. The temperature dropped 20 degrees overnight, which was strange for October. When I woke up, frost covered everything, even though it had been 7 degrees the day before. The air smelled different too, sharper. like sulfur mixed with something burning far away. I drove up to the ridge at dawn to meet Dr. Patterson's team, the Crack. In the rock face was bigger now, maybe 8 feet wide and tall enough for a truck to drive through. Cold air rushed out of it, carrying that sulfur smell. Dr. Patterson stood at the entrance with his equipment, grinning like Christmas morning. "Caleb," he called out, "you've got to see this. The thermal readings are incredible. There's a whole cave system in there, and the temperature variations are unlike anything I've ever recorded." I walked over to look at his instruments. The numbers didn't make sense. The temperature inside the cave was reading both 30 degrees and 120 degrees at the same time, depending on which sensor you looked at. "Equipment malfunction?" I asked. Dr. Patterson shook his head. "All 3 units are giving the same readings. It's like there are hot and cold zones right next to each other in there." He was excited. I was starting to feel sick to my stomach. That's when I noticed the silence. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering. Even the insects had gone quiet. In 20 years of working these woods, I'd never heard silence like that. It felt like the whole mountain was holding its breath. Dr. Patterson went into the cave at 10 in the morning with 2 of his assistants. The plan was simple. Map the immediate cave system, take temperature and mineral samples, be out by noon. By 2 o'clock, they hadn't come back. By 4 o'clock, I was getting worried. I called into the cave entrance, my voice echoing off the walls. No answer. I tried my radio, nothing but static. The other team members were nervous. Dr. Sarah Wells, Patterson's second in command, kept checking her watch and muttering about how Patterson never broke protocol like this. "He said noon," she repeated. "James always sticks to the timeline." I grabbed my rescue gear and headed for the cave entrance. The sulfur smell was stronger now, and something else had joined it. Something sweet and rotting, like flowers left in the sun too long. The cave entrance led to a narrow tunnel that curved down into the mountain. My flashlight beam disappeared into the darkness ahead, showing smooth walls that looked almost polished, too smooth for natural rock formation. I called out again. This time, I heard something. Not Patterson's voice, but a low rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep inside the mountain. It lasted exactly 37 seconds, just like the earthquakes. The temperature dropped as I went deeper. Then, suddenly, it got hot. Really hot. Hot enough that I started sweating despite the October chill outside. My flashlight beam caught something on the cave wall ahead. Carvings. Old ones, by the look of them. Cherokee symbols that I recognized from my grandmother's stories, warnings about the fire serpent that guarded the deep places of the earth. I found Dr. Patterson in a chamber about 50 yards into the cave. He was sitting against the wall, eyes wide open, completely still. At first I thought he was just scared or in shock. Then I got closer and saw his skin. He was cooked, not burned from the outside like a fire, but cooked from the inside out. His skin was red and blistered, his clothes dry as paper. The stone floor around him was cracked from heat, but when I knelt down next to him, the ground was cool to the touch. His thermometer was still in his hand. The reading showed 147 degrees. Internal body temperature. No human being can survive that kind of heat inside their body. I checked for a pulse anyway. Nothing. Dr. James Patterson was dead, killed by something that had raised his body temperature to lethal levels without burning anything else around him. That's when I heard it again. The rumbling sound, closer this time, and underneath it, something that sounded almost like breathing. Slow, deep breathing from something very large. I got out of that cave faster than I'd ever moved in my life. Dr. Wells took the news badly. She wanted to go in after Patterson herself. Bring out his body. Continue the research. The other team members were split between scientific curiosity and common sense. "We need to call this in," I told them. "Get a proper rescue team, maybe the state police." "With what explanation?" Dr. Wells asked. "That something inside the mountain cooked our team leader from the inside? They'll think we're crazy." She had a point. I'd seen it myself, and I wasn't sure I believed it. We compromised. I called for backup, but kept the details vague. Equipment malfunction, possible cave-in, 1 fatality, the kind of thing that happens sometimes on geological surveys. While we waited for help to arrive, Dr. Wells set up her equipment outside the cave entrance. thermal imaging, seismic monitors, electromagnetic sensors. Within an hour, she had readings that made no sense. "There's something massive moving inside the mountain," she said, staring at her screens. "The thermal signature is... It's huge, Caleb. Maybe 500 feet long, moving through the cave system like... Like what?" "Like a snake," she whispered. That night, while we waited for the rescue team, the mountain rumbled again. But this time the earthquake was different. Instead of the deep, rhythmic tremors we'd been getting, this felt angry, violent. The ground shook so hard that rocks fell from the ridge above us, and the crack in the mountain face got bigger, much bigger. Maria Santos, one of the graduate students on Patterson's team, couldn't sleep. She kept walking around the camp, checking equipment, muttering about impossible readings and scientific mysteries. Around midnight, she announced that she was going to take a quick look inside the cave. I tried to stop her. Dr. Wells tried to stop her, but Maria was young and stubborn and convinced that science could explain anything if you just gathered enough data. She took a thermal camera and a radio, promise. Ed to stay in the entrance chamber, said she'd be back in 30 minutes. We found her body the next morning, deeper in the cave than she should have been. Like Patterson, she was cooked from the inside. But Maria's death was worse. Her body temperature had gotten so high that parts of her had actually started to crystallize, like she'd been flash-heated in a furnace. The thermal camera was melted. The radio was a puddle of plastic and metal. But somehow, impossibly, her notebook had survived. The last entry, written in shaking handwriting, said, "It's not a cave system. It's a burrow, and something's coming up." That's when I knew we weren't dealing with any kind of natural phenomenon. That's when I started to remember all the old stories my grandmother had told me about the things that lived in the deep places of the earth. And that's when the real nightmare began. The rescue team arrived at dawn. 3 state troopers, a paramedic, and a cave rescue specialist named Tom Bradley, who'd worked with me before on mountain emergencies. I'd known Tom for 10 years. He was solid, practical, not the kind of guy who believed in ghost stories. That changed real fast. We explained the situation as best we could without sounding completely insane. 2 dead researchers, possible toxic gas in the caves, unstable geological conditions. The kind of story that would get us help without getting us committed. Tom suited up in full cave rescue gear and went in to recover the bodies. He was back out in 15 minutes, pale as paper and shaking. "Caleb," he said, pulling off his helmet, "what the hell is in there?" "What did you see?" "I saw Patterson and the Santos girl, just like you said. But that's not what's got me spooked." He looked back at the cave entrance like it might bite him. "The whole cave system is wrong. Those aren't natural formations. The walls are too smooth, too ragu, lar. And they're warm. Not hot, just warm, like something alive." He showed me his camera. The photos of the cave interior looked like the inside of something organic. Curved walls with a texture that seemed almost scaly. Branching passages that looked less like tunnels and more like arteries. "And there's more," Tom continued. "I found these." He opened his equipment bag and pulled out what looked like a piece of snakeskin, except it was huge. Each scale was bigger than my hand, and the whole piece was maybe 4 feet long. Dr. Wells nearly snatched it out of his hands. She held it up to the light, examining the structure, muttering scientific terms under her breath. Finally, she looked up at us with fear in her eyes. "This is real," she said quietly. "This came from something alive, something very large." That afternoon, while the state police were setting up a perimeter and making official reports, the cave system rumbled again. But this time we felt it differently. The ground didn't just shake. It rippled, like something enormous was moving underneath us. The thermal imaging equipment that Dr. Wells had left running went crazy. The screens showed a massive heat signature moving through the mountain, following what looked like a network of tunnels that stretched for miles in every direction. It's not just under Devil's Backbone, Dr. Wells realized, studying the data. This cave system runs under the whole forest, maybe 50 square miles of tunnels and chambers. Robert Kim, a speleologist from the University of Pittsburgh who'd driven down to help with the cave exploration, laughed when he saw the thermal readings. "That's impossible," he said. "You can't have a cave system that large without someone mapping it already. I know every major cave in West Virginia." To prove his point, Kim suited up and went into the caves with full mapping equipment. He was an expert, had explored caves all over the world. He knew what he was doing. We found his body the next day in a chamber 200 feet down. Like the others, he'd been killed by internal heat. But Kim's death was the worst yet. The temperature had gotten so high that his body had actually fused with the cave wall. Parts of him had turned to glass and crystal, like he'd been flash melted and then cooled. But before he died, Kim had managed to map part of the cave system. His notes showed a network of chambers and tunnels that defied everything we knew about local geology. And at the center of it all, a massive circular chamber that his equipment couldn't fully measure. That night, I called my grandmother. She was 83 years old and living on the Cherokee Reservation in North Carolina, but her mind was still sharp as a knife. I told her about Devil's Backbone, about the earthquakes and the cave and the people who'd died. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Grandson," she finally said, "you found Uktena Usti." "Grandmother, I need to know if the stories are real." "The great serpent sleeps beneath the mountains, guarding the firestones that give power to the earth. It has slept for many lifetimes, but when men dig too deep, when they disturb the sacred places, Uktena Usti wakes." "How do I stop it?" "You don't stop it, grandson. You make peace with it. The old treaties, the old ways. Or it will burn the whole forest to protect what it guards." The next morning, a team of federal geologists arrived. They'd been sent by someone high up in the government, someone who'd gotten word about the unusual seismic activity. These weren't ordinary scientists. They had military escorts and equipment I'd never seen before. Their leader was a woman named Linda Hayes, a mining surveyor who specialized in identifying valuable mineral deposits. She took one look at the cave entrance and started talking about rare earth elements and mining rights. "The electromagnetic readings suggest significant crystal deposits," she told her team, "possibly valuable enough to justify a full extraction operation." I tried to warn her, told her about the deaths, about the thermal anomalies, about the Cherokee legends. She listened politely and then basically ignored everything I'd said. "Mr. Stormcrow," she said, "I appreciate your concern, but we're here to do a job. There's nothing in these caves that proper equipment and safety protocols can't handle." Hayes suited up with full environmental protection gear and went into the caves with 2 assistants. They had gas detectors, thermal suits, everything the previous victims hadn't had. It didn't matter. We heard the screaming from outside the cave, high, awful screaming that echoed off the walls and seemed to go on forever. Then silence. Then a sound like steam escaping from a pressure cooker. When the screaming stopped, superheated gas started pouring out of the cave entrance. The grass around the opening withered and died in seconds. The temperature spiked to over 100 degrees, even outside in the October air. Hayes and her team never came out. That evening, as we were setting up a wider perimeter around the cave, the mountain spoke to me. I was checking the thermal equipment when I felt the ground vibrate beneath my feet. Not an earthquake this time, but something rhythmic, something that sounded almost like a heartbeat. Then the vibrations changed. They became patterns, rhythms that reminded me of something I'd heard before. My grandmother singing Cherokee lullabies when I was a child. The mountain was speaking Cherokee, ancient Cherokee, older than any living person could remember. But somehow, I understood it. "Leave this place," it said. "Leave or burn." I looked up at Devil's Backbone, at the jagged ridge silhouetted against the evening sky, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw something moving up there. Something huge, coiled among the rocks like a snake made of shadow and fire. That's when I knew we were dealing with something far older and more dangerous than any of us had imagined. And that's when I read, Liz, that all the people who died weren't just unlucky. They were warnings. The federal agents arrived at dawn. 3 black SUVs, 8 agents in dark suits, and a man who introduced himself as Agent William Chen from some department I'd never heard of. They took over the investigation, declared the area a federal crime scene, and told everyone except essential personnel to leave immediately. I wasn't essential personnel, according to Agent Chen. I was a local ranger who'd gotten in over his head. But this was my forest, my responsibility. I wasn't leaving. "Mr. Stormcrow," Chen said, "we have the situation under control. This is a matter of national security now." "National security?" I asked. "What kind of national security involves people being cooked from the inside out?" Chen's expression didn't change. "The kind that requires specialized equipment and trained personnel. Your services are no longer needed." But Dr. Wells backed me up. She'd been working with the thermal imaging data, and she needed someone who knew the local geology, someone who could guide them through the broader cave system that we now knew extended far beyond Devil's Backbone. Reluctantly, Chen agreed to let me stay as a technical consultant. He made it clear that I was to follow orders, stay quiet, and not ask questions about things above my clearance level. That afternoon, Chen's team brought in equipment I'd never seen before: military-grade thermal imaging, electromagnetic sensors, and something that looked like a small radar dish. They set up a command post and started mapping the underground cave system with precision that made our previous efforts look like amateur hour. The results were terrifying. The tunnel network extends under approximately 60 square miles, Agent Chen announced, studying the data. The central chamber is roughly circular, with a diameter of nearly a quarter mile. The thermal signature suggests something alive in there, something generating significant heat. Dr. Wells showed him the scale samples that Tom had found. Based on the size and structure, we're looking at something between 400 and 600 feet long. Chen nodded like 600-foot underground serpents were perfectly normal parts of his job. "What are its movement patterns?" "It seems to be following the tunnel system," Dr. Wells replied. "Moving in regular circuits like it's patrolling its territory. But the patterns are getting faster, more aggressive." That's when one of Chen's technicians called out from the monitoring station. "Sir, we're getting massive electromagnetic spikes from the central chamber. Something's happening down there." The ground began to shake. Not the slow, rhythmic tremors we'd been experiencing, but violent shaking that knocked equipment off tables and sent rocks rolling down the mountainside. The earthquake lasted 3 minutes and registered 4.2 on the seismic scale. When it was over, the crack in Devil's Backbone had widened to nearly 20 feet. Heat poured out of it like an open furnace, and the sulfur smell was so strong that we had to put on gas masks. "It's coming up," I said. Chen looked at me sharply. "What do you mean, coming up?" "The Cherokee stories. My grandmother told me that when Uktena Usti is angry, when its territory is threatened, it rises to the surface to defend its home." "Cherokee stories?" Chen's voice was flat, skeptical. "Agent Chen," I said, 5 people are dead. Your scientific equipment is telling you there's something impossible living under this mountain. Maybe it's time to consider that the Cherokee knew what they were talking about." Before Chen could respond, his radio crackled to life. One of his agents, stationed on the ridge above us, was reporting massive ground fractures and extreme temperature spikes. "Sir," the agent's voice was tight with fear, "you need to see this. The whole ridge is splitting open." We climbed up to the observation point and looked down at Devil's Backbone. The entire ridge was cracked like a broken eggshell. Steam and sulfur gas poured out of the fissures, and deep inside, something was glowing, something big. As we watched, part of the ridge collapsed, revealing a cavern larger than a cathedral. And coiled inside that cavern, visible for the first time in centuries, was Uktena Usti. It was beautiful and terrible. Its body was thick as an old-growth oak tree, covered in scales that looked like polished obsidian. Along its massive head, a crown of crystal spikes caught the light and threw it back in rainbow patterns. Its eyes were like searchlights, burning with an inner fire that seemed to look right through you. But the most frightening thing about it wasn't its size or its alien beauty. It was the intelligence in those burning eyes. This wasn't just an animal. This was something that thought, something that planned, something that remembered. Agent Chen stared at the creature for a long moment, then slowly reached for his radio. Command, this is Chen. We have a situation that requires immediate escalation. The serpent's head turned toward us, and I felt its attention like a physical weight. When it spoke, the words came up through the ground, vibrations that formed sounds in the ancient Cherokee language. Too late, it said. The treaty is broken. The sacred places are violated. Now, the forest burns. Smoke began rising from the trees around Devil's Backbone. Not regular fire smoke, but something chemical and wrong. The trees weren't catching fire from the outside. They were burning from the inside out, just like the people who died in the caves. Agent Chen was shouting orders into his radio, calling for helicopter support and hazmat teams. Dr. Wells was frantically taking readings on equipment that was already starting to malfunction from the heat. But I was listening to my grandmother's voice, in my memory, remembering the stories she'd told me about the fire serpent and the treaties the Cherokee had made with it long ago. Agent Chen, I called out over the noise. I need to get to the Cherokee reservation. There's someone I need to talk to. Are you insane? Chen shouted back. We're in the middle of a crisis situation. That's exactly why I need to go, I said. The Cherokee made peace with this thing before. Maybe they can do it again. The serpent's head rose higher, towering above the trees. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of crystal teeth, and flame poured out across the mountainside. Real fire this time, burning everything it touched. Agent Chen looked at the spreading flames, then at his useless equipment, then at me. How long do you need? Maybe 6 hours, if I can find the right elder, if the old knowledge is still there. We don't have 6 hours, Chen said as another section of forest burst into flames. That's when the serpent looked directly at me. Its burning eyes met mine, and I heard its voice inside my head instead of through the ground. You carry the old blood, it said. You know the old words. Speak them, or watch the forest die. I realized then that this had been meant to happen. The earthquakes, the cave opening, even the deaths. They'd all been leading to this moment. The serpent hadn't just been awakened by accident. It had been calling to someone who could understand it, someone who could choose between the old ways and the new world. Someone like me. I stood at the edge of Devil's Backbone as the forest burned around me. Agent Chen and his team were evacuating, their equipment useless against something that existed outside the boundaries of normal science. Dr. Wells was documenting everything, still believing that data could somehow explain what was happening. But I knew better. This wasn't about science or national security or mineral rights. This was about respect, about promises made and broken, about the balance between the human world and the older powers that lived beneath it. The great serpent, Yuki, Tina Usti, waited in its revealed chamber. The fire from its breath had spread across 2 square miles of forest, burning with a heat that consumed trees from the inside out. It could have destroyed the entire national forest if it wanted to. Instead, it was waiting for my answer. I thought about my grandmother's stories, about the treaties the Cherokee had made with the fire serpent centuries ago. Agreements that recognized its guardianship of the sacred places, its role as protector of the crystal caves and the spiritual power they contained. Those treaties had been forgotten when white settlers came to the mountains. The serpent had gone back to sleep rather than fight a war it couldn't win without destroying everything it was meant to protect. But modern mining and drilling had finally pushed it too far. I walked down into the revealed chamber, stepping carefully over the cracked stone. The heat was incredible, like standing next to a blast furnace, but somehow bearable. The serpent's eyes tracked my movement, but it didn't attack. You know why I wake? Its voice echoed in my mind. Yes, I said aloud, speaking Cherokee words I barely remembered from childhood. The sacred places are threatened. The old agreements are broken. The crystal caves hold the power that feeds the earth's spirit. Men would dig them up, sell them, scatter them. The balance would break. The world would sicken. I looked around the chamber and saw what it was protecting. The walls were lined with crystals unlike anything I'd ever seen. They pulsed with their own light, humming with energy that I could feel in my bones. These weren't just pretty rocks. They were something essential, something that needed to stay where it was. "What do you want?" I asked. "A new treaty, new agreements. The sacred places must be protected forever, or I will burn every human settlement from here to the Guerri, at water. I can't speak for the government. I'm just a forest ranger." The serpent's massive head lowered until it was level with mine. Up close, I could see that its scales were carved, with symbols, Cherokee writing that looked older than any human settlement in these mountains. "You carry the old blood. You speak the old tongue. You can choose for your people, as your ancestors chose." I realized then that this was bigger than just me, bigger than the Forest Service or federal agents or scientific research. This was about whether humans could still remember how to live in balance with the forces that shape the world. "What kind of treaty?" I asked. "The deep places remain untouched. No mining, no drilling, no machines that disturb the earth's bones. In return, I sleep again. The fires stop. The forest heals." It was a simple bargain, the kind our ancestors had made when they understood that some things were more important than profit or progress. But I was one man, and the world had changed since the Cherokee ruled these mountains. "How do I know the government will honor an agreement like that?" The serpent's eyes flared brighter. "You will make them understand. Show them what happens when the old treaties are broken. Make them remember that some powers are older than their machines." Agent Chen's voice crackled from my radio. "Stormcrow, what's your status? The fire is spreading toward the highway." I looked up at the serpent, at the burning forest beyond, at the choice that would define the rest of my life. "I accept," I said in Cherokee. "I'll speak for the treaty." The serpent reared back, its crown of crystal spikes catching the light from the fires above. It opened its mouth, and instead of flame, it sang. A low harmonic sound that resonated through the mountain and seemed to reach every living thing in the forest. The fires went out, not gradually, but all at once, like someone had thrown a switch. The superheated air cooled to normal October temperatures. The sulfur smell faded, replaced by the clean scent of mountain air. "Remember, T," the serpent said as it began to coil back into the depths of the mountain. "The treaty holds as long as the sacred places remain untouched. Break it again, and next time there will be no negotiation." The chamber began to close as the serpent settled back into its ancient rest. Rock flowed like water, sealing the gaps, hiding the crystal caves from human eyes. Within minutes, Devil's Backbone looked almost normal again, just a ridge with some new cracks and a few black patches where the fires had burned. I climbed back up to where Agent Chen and his team were waiting. They stared at me like I'd just walked out of hell itself. "What happened down there?" Chen asked. "We reached an understanding," I said. "Devil's Backbone and the surrounding area need to be designated as protected wilderness. No mining, no drilling, no development of any kind." "On whose authority?" I looked back at the ridge, where something vast and ancient had just returned to its sleep. "On the authority of something that was here long before any of us, and will be here long after we're gone." It took 3 months of paperwork, congressional hearings, and environmental impact studies, but Devil's Backbone was eventually designated as a protected wilderness area. Officially, it was due to unique geological conditions and potential seismic instability. The real reason was buried in classified files that most people would never see. Agent Chen helped push the designation through. He'd seen what I'd seen, and he understood that some things were more important than mineral rights or national security. The Cherokee Nation was brought in as partners in protecting the area, recognizing their historical connection to the land. I stayed on as the primary ranger for Devil's Backbone, which meant I was responsible for making sure the treaty held. It's been quiet since then. No earthquakes, no mysterious death. No government mining surveys. Just a peaceful ridge where the trees grow thick and the crystals sleep safely in their deep caves. But sometimes, on cold October nights when the wind blows, through the mountains I can feel something stirring far beneath the earth. something vast and patient and very much aware of what's happening on the surface. The Cherokee were right about many things. They understood that some guardians are older than human memory and that not all of them are benevolent. They knew that the earth has its own defenses, its own ways of protecting what needs to be protected. They also knew that the best way to live with such powers is to respect them, to honor the agreements our ancestors made, and to remember that we're not the only intelligence on this planet. I'm 53 now, still ranging the mountains, still watching over Devil's Backbone. Sometimes I get requests from mining companies or development groups, people who want to reassess the geological potential of the area. I always tell them the same thing. Some places are meant to stay wild. Some treaties are more important than profit. And some guardians never really sleep. They just close their eyes and wait to see if we've learned anything from our mistakes. The Devil's Backbone is quiet now, but I know it's listening, waiting to see if the new treaty will hold better than the old ones did. For all our sakes, I hope it does. My name is Mordecai Ashwood, and I've been a forest ranger for 11 years. People think it's a quiet job, just walking trails and telling tourists not to feed the bears. They're wrong. The Chattahoochee National Forest in North Georgia has shown me things that still wake me up at night. I'm part Cherokee on my mother's side, though I never paid much attention to the old stories growing up. My dad was English, a practical man who taught me to trust what I could see and touch. That mix served me well as a ranger. I could track better than most, understood the forest like it was family, but I kept my feet on the ground. In 1984, I was 36 and in charge of the equestrian program. That meant I spent most of my days on horseback, riding the mountain trails that were too rough for trucks. I'd been a rodeo rider in my 20s, so being in the saddle felt natural. My horse, Thunder, was a steady paint who'd never spooked at anything. Not bears, not rattlesnakes, not even the occasional wildcat we'd run across. The Chattahoochee covers almost 750,000 acres, stretching from the Blue Ridge Mountains down into the foothills. Most people stick to the main trails, but my job took me into the deep country where cell phones didn't work and the nearest road might be 20 miles away. I liked it that way. The silence up there was complete, broken only by wind through the pines and the sound of Thunder's hooves on the rocky trails. That summer started normal enough. Tourist season brought the usual problems. People getting lost, leaving trash, trying to pet the wildlife. But by July, something felt different. The animals were acting strange. Deer would bolt at nothing, birds would go quiet for hours at a time, and I found several dead raccoons with no obvious cause of death. Thunder noticed it too. He'd stop suddenly on trails he'd walked 100 times, ears forward, noste, riles flaring like he smelled something that scared him. When I'd urge him forward, he'd go, but reluctantly, looking back over his shoulder like something was following us. The first report came in on a Tuesday morning in late July. A group of hikers had called in a strange sighting from the Panther Creek area. They claimed they'd seen riders on horseback during a thunderstorm the night before, but these weren't normal riders. According to their report, the horses looked like skeletons, and the riders were pale as moonlight. My supervisor, Jim Hartley, laughed when he read it to me. "City folk," he said, shaking his head. "Probably saw some locals heading home and their imagination did the rest." But I wasn't so sure. The Panther Creek area was remote, accessible only by foot or horseback. No one lived back there, and the trails were too dangerous to ride at night, especially in a storm. Still, people saw what they wanted to see. Maybe it was just shadows and lightning playing tricks. That changed when more reports came in. Different groups, different nights, but always the same story. Pale riders on skeletal horses, appearing during thunderstorms and vanishing like smoke. One woman swore she'd seen them riding straight up the face of a cliff. A man claimed their horses breathed fire, and their eyes glowed like hot coals. I'd spent my whole life in these mountains and never believed in ghost stories. The Cherokee side of my family had plenty of them. Spirits in the forest, creatures that hunted bad people, warnings about respecting the land. But I was a ranger, trained to deal with facts, not folklore. That's what I told myself anyway, right up until I found the first set of tracks. I rode out to Panther Creek on the first clear morning in August. The area sat in a deep valley surrounded by ridges thick with oak and pine. A creek ran down the middle, feeding several small waterfalls that tourists like to photograph. It was beautiful country, but isolated. The nearest trail marker was 5 miles away. I followed the main path for about an hour before Thunder started acting up again. His ears went flat against his head, and he sidestepped nervously. I dismounted to check his hooves, thinking maybe he'd picked up a stone, but they were clean. That's when I saw them. Horseshoe prints in the mud beside the creek. Nothing unusual about that. The area was open to equestrian use. But these prints were different. They were burned into the ground, the soil around them baked hard like it had been in an oven. The metal marks were so deep they'd gone through mud into solid rock underneath. I knelt down and touched one. The ground was still warm. Thunder whinnied and backed away, pulling hard on his reins. His eyes were wide with fear, showing white around the edges. In 11 years of partnership, I'd never seen him panic like that. I looked around, expecting to see a bear or wildcat, but the forest was empty. Even the birds had gone quiet. That's when I noticed something else. Every tree within 50 feet of the tracks was dead. Not dying, not diseased, completely dead. Their bark black and peeling, leaves brown and brittle even though it was the height of summer. The grass was burned in patches, forming rough circles around each hoofprint. I took photos, though I doubted they'd come out right. The camera felt warm in my hands, and the batteries died after 3 shots even though they'd been fresh that morning. My compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. Even my watch had stopped. I remounted Thunder and followed the trail of burned hoofprints. They led along the creek for maybe half a mile before turning up a steep ridge. The prints went straight up the rock face, spaced exactly like a horse at full gallop, but no horse could run up a 90-degree cliff. At the top of the ridge, the trail ended. Just stopped, like the riders had launched themselves into the air. I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Everything in my training said there had to be a rational explanation. Hoax, maybe, or some kind of chemical spill that had burned the ground and killed the trees. But deep down, in the part of me that came from my Cherokee ancestors, I knew better. This was something else entirely. I was still standing there, staring at the impossible tracks, when I heard the scream. It came from back down in the valley, high-pitched and terrified. Then it cut off suddenly, like someone had thrown a switch. Thunder danced under me, wanting to run, but I turned him toward the sound. Whatever was happening down there, it was my job to help. We found David Thompson at the bottom of a ravine, 50 yards from where I'd first seen the burned tracks. He was a 25-year-old hiker from Atlanta, up for a long weekend with his girlfriend. Now he was dead, his body broken like he'd been trampled by horses. But there were no horses around. Just Thompson, lying in the dirt, with hoofprints covering his body. The same burned prints I'd been following, pressed deep into his flesh. His backpack was shredded, his water bottles melted, and his metal camping gear was twisted into impossible shapes. His girlfriend, Sarah Chen, was crouched behind a boulder, 30 feet away. She was in shock, rocking back and forth and whispering the same thing over and over. Their eyes glowed like fire. I called for backup on my radio, but got only static. Tried my cell phone, no signal. We were on our own until I could get Sarah out of there and back to civilization. "Sarah," I said, kneeling beside her. "I'm Ranger Ashwood. You're safe now. Can you tell me what happened?" She looked up at me with blank, terrified eyes. "They came out of nowhere," she whispered. "We were just setting up camp. The sky was clear, but suddenly there was thunder. Lightning. And then they were there." "Who was there?" "The riders. On horses made of bones. They surrounded Dave. He tried to run, but..." She started crying, great racking sobs that shook her whole body. I looked around the campsite. Their tent was shredded, ground into the dirt by countless hooves, but there were no normal horse tracks, no trail leading to or from the area. Just those burned prints, appearing and disappearing like the riders had materialized out of thin air. The horses breathed fire, Sarah continued. Real fire. And the riders, they were so pale, like they'd never seen sunlight. They had weapons, spears that looked like lightning. I helped Sarah onto Thunder's back and led him out of the valley on foot. It took 3 hours to reach the ranger station, and by then she'd retreated into complete silence. The paramedics said she was in severe shock, possibly traumatized for life. The official report listed David Thompson's death as an animal attack. A bear, probably, or possibly wild boars. The hoof prints were explained as post-mortem damage from local horses that had wandered through the scene. The burned ground was blamed on a lightning strike. I didn't argue with the report. How could I? But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew it wasn't over. Something was hunting in my forest, something that left burned hoof prints in solid rock and could appear and disappear at will. That night, I called my great-aunt Mary, the only member of my family who still remembered the old Cherokee stories. She lived on the reservation, in a little house my great-grandfather had built. "Aunt Mary," I said, "what do you know about ghost riders?" There was a long pause. When she spoke, her voice was very quiet. "Why are you asking, Mordecai?" So I told her. About the tracks, about Thompson, about the horses that breathed fire, and the riders pale as death. When I finished, she was silent for so long I thought the connection had been lost. "Envy Equa," she said finally. "The Wild Hunt. I haven't heard that name in 40 years. Tell me." "They're Cherokee spirits, Mordecai. Warriors who died protecting the land. When someone breaks the natural law, when they hurt the earth for profit, the Envy Equa come to collect payment." "Payment?" "Souls," she said simply. "They ride the thunder and hunt with lightning spears. And once they start hunting, they don't stop until justice is done." I hung up the phone with my hands shaking. The Wild Hunt was riding again, and I was the only one who believed it was real, the only one who might be able to stop it. But first, I had to understand what had awakened them. The second death happened 3 days later. Bill Harrison was a foreman for Piedmont Logging, a company that had been cutting trees in the national forest under a federal permit. They were supposed to be doing selective harvesting, taking only marked trees and leaving the forest intact. But I'd been suspicious of their operations for months. Too many unmarked trees were disappearing. Too many access roads were being cut where none should exist. Harrison was found at dawn by his own crew, dead in his truck at a logging site 15 miles from Panther Creek. Heart attack, the coroner said, brought on by extreme terror. But his crew told a different story. "He was screaming about horses," one of them told me. "Said they were all around the truck, breathing fire on the windows, but we couldn't see anything. Just Bill, thrashing around inside like he was fighting for his life." The truck's windows were cracked in spiderweb patterns, as if something had struck them from outside. The metal was warped and twisted, the paint blistered like it had been exposed to intense heat, and all around the vehicle, burned into the logging road, were the same hoof prints I'd found at Panther Creek. I started keeping a map, marking every sighting and every incident. A pattern began to emerge. The riders always appeared during or just before thunderstorms. They too targeted people involved in activities that damaged the forest. Illegal logging, unauthorized mining, polluters dumping chemicals in the streams. And their hunting ground was expanding. What kid started at Panther Creek was spreading across the entire national forest, following what looked like ancient Cherokee hunting trails. The spirits were moving with purpose, systematic in their vengeance. Frank Rodriguez was next. He supervised a strip mining operation just outside the forest boundary, but his company had been dumping wastewater into tributaries that fed into protected watersheds. He was found trampled to death in his own backyard, his body covered with the same burned hoof prints. Neighbors reported hearing the thunder of horses' hooves all night, but no one saw any animals. "This is getting out of hand," Jim Hartley said during our morning briefing. 3 deaths in 2 weeks, all of them connected to resource extraction companies. The media is starting to ask questions. "What kind of questions?" I asked. "The kind that mention environmental terrorism. There's talk of bringing in the FBI." I almost laughed. The FBI wouldn't know what to do with ghostwriters any more than we did. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the NV Aqua wanted attention, wanted the whole world to know that the Earth had protectors who wouldn't be bought or intimidated. That afternoon, I rode out to the Harrison logging site. The crews had abandoned it after Bill's death, leaving behind thousands of dollars worth of equipment. Chainsaws sat rusting in the rain. Bulldozers were parked in neat rows, their metal surfaces pitted and scorched. Thunder was skittish as we approached, but he didn't panic like before. Maybe he was getting used to the supernatural presence, or maybe the spirits recognized that I wasn't their enemy. I dismounted and walked among the abandoned machines, looking for clues. That's when I found the Cherokee artifacts. They were buried under a pile of brush that the loggers had cleared probably weeks ago. Sacred stones arranged in a careful pattern, each one carved with symbols I didn't recognize but somehow understood. This had been a holy site, a place where my ancestors had conducted ceremonies and spoke with spirits. The logging company had torn through it like it was nothing, scattering the stones and cutting down trees that might have been standing when Cherokee warriors first walked these mountains. They'd violated something sacred, and now the spirits were demanding justice. I was still kneeling by the scattered stones when the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. Thunder whinnied nervously, and I could smell ozone in the air like before a lightning strike. But the sky was clear, not a cloud in sight. Then I heard them. Hoofbeats, distant at first but growing closer. The sound of many horses moving at full gallop, their breathing harsh and labored like they'd been running for hours. I stood slowly, looking around the empty logging site. They came out of the forest like a storm front, pale riders on skeletal horses that seemed to glow with their own light. I counted 7 of them, arranged in a V formation like migrating geese. Their faces were gaunt and sharp, with eyes that burned like hot coals. They carried spears that crackled with electrical energy, and their horses left trails of fire in the air. The lead rider was different from the others, taller, more solid, wearing the remnants of traditional Cherokee war dress. Feathers in his hair, war paint on his face, a breastplate made of bone and silver. When he looked at me, I felt like he could see straight through to my soul. They circled me 3 times, the horses' hooves never quite touching the ground. The sound of their movement was like thunder, rolling and echoing off the mountain ridges. Then they stopped, arranged in a line facing me, and the leader spoke. His voice was like wind through dead leaves, speaking Cherokee words that I somehow understood even though I'd never learned the language. "Blood calls for blood," he said. "The earth cries out for justice." "Justice for what?" I asked, surprised that I could speak at all. "For the rape of sacred ground, for the poisoning of water, for the murder of trees older than memory." His burning eyes looked past me to the scattered Cherokee stones. "They take and take and take, giving nothing back, showing no respect, no honor. So you're killing them. We collect what is owed. Those who profit from destruction owe their lives to the land they damage. And after you've killed them all? Then what?" He smiled, and it was terrible to see. "Then others will learn. Fear is a powerful teacher." The wind picked up, scattering leaves and debris around us. In the distance, I could hear real thunder now, a storm building over the mountains. The horses stamped impatiently, eager to resume their hunt. "The federal inspector comes tomorrow," the war chief said. "She carries papers that will allow more destruction, more desecration. We will teach her the true cost of her greed. She's just doing her job, following orders. As were the soldiers who drove us from our lands in 1838. As were the miners who poisoned our streams. As were the loggers who cut our sacred groves." His horse reared up, breathing a gout of flame that singed my eyebrows. "Some debts can only be paid in blood." They wheeled around and galloped back into the forest, leaving me alone with the scattered stones and the growing storm. But I knew now what I had to do. The federal inspector, Janet Williams from the EPA, was coming to approve new mining permits. If I couldn't stop her, the NV Equa would. The question was, which would be worse? Janet Williams arrived the next morning in a white government SUV, accompanied by 2 mining company executives and a briefcase full of environmental impact assessments. I met them at the ranger station, hoping I could somehow talk them out of their plans without sounding completely insane. "Ms. Williams," I said, "I need to speak with you about the Panther Creek area." She was a small, efficient woman in her 40s with graying hair and the no-nonsense attitude of someone who dealt with bureaucracy for a living. "I'm familiar with the site, Ranger Ashwood. The environmental surveys show minimal impact from the proposed mining operations. Those surveys didn't account for recent developments." One of the executives, a man named Steve Chen, who worked for the permit office, laughed. "What kind of developments? You found an endangered species of butterfly?" I wanted to tell them about the ghost riders, about the burned hoof prints, and the bodies trampled by supernatural horses. Instead, I said, "There's been unusual seismic activity in the area. I'm concerned about unstable ground conditions." It was a weak excuse, and Williams saw right through it. "According to our geological surveys, the area is perfectly stable. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to do." They drove off toward Panther Creek, leaving me standing in the parking lot with a growing sense of dread. The storm from the night before had passed, but I could feel another one building. The air was too still, too charged with electricity. Even the birds had stopped singing. I saddled Thunder and followed them, pushing him harder than I ever had before. Maybe I could still warn them, still get them out of the area before the NV Iqua arrived. But I was already too late. The government SUV was parked at the end of the access road, doors open and engines still running. Williams and the two executives were standing around a surveyor's transit, marking boundaries for the new mining operation. They were arguing about something, probably how much forest they could legally destroy. That's when the wind died completely. Thunder froze beneath me, every muscle tensed. The air pressure dropped like we were in the eye of a hurricane, and my ears popped. The distance. I could hear hoofbeats approaching like rolling thunder. "Get in the truck," I yelled, riding toward them. "Get in the truck and drive away. Now!" Williams looked up at me like I'd lost my mind. "Ranger Ashwood, what are you—" The sky split open. Lightning crashed down in a dozen places at once, but there were no clouds, no storm. Just jagged bolts of electricity tearing through clear air, followed immediately by the thunder of horses' hooves. The Envi Equa came riding down the lightning itself, their pale forms outlined in electrical fire. Steve Chen screamed and ran for the SUV, but a spear of pure lightning struck him in the back before he could reach it. He collapsed, smoke rising from his clothes, and didn't move again. The second executive, a woman named Patricia Johnson from the mining company, tried to hide behind the surveyor's equipment. A skeletal horse materialized beside her, breathing fire that melted the metal instruments and left her surrounded by molten steel. Williams stood her ground, briefcase clutched in her hands like a shield. "This isn't possible," she whispered. "This can't be happening." The war chief rode directly toward her, his spear crackling with electrical energy. But instead of striking, he stopped just out of reach and studied her with those burning eyes. "You carry papers," he said in that wind-through-leaves voice. "Papers that give permission to wound the earth." I work for the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. I'm here to make sure the mining follows federal guidelines." He laughed, a sound like branches breaking. "Protection? You call this protection?" He gestured toward the marked boundaries, the surveyor's stakes that outlined the area to be strip-mined. "You're here to give permission for rape. The environmental impact will be minimal. The company has agreed to restoration." "Lies." His horse stepped closer and Williams backed away. "The same lies they told in 1838. The same lies they tell now. Take what you want, promise restoration, then disappear when the land is dead." I rode between them, knowing it was probably suicide, but unable to watch another person die. "Wait," I said to the war chief. "She's not the real enemy here." Those burning eyes turned on me. "Explain." "She's just following orders, doing her job. The real criminals are the ones who make the policies, who write the laws that allow this to happen. Kill her, and they'll send someone else. Nothing changes." "Then what do you propose?" I looked at Williams, who was staring at us in shock, probably wondering if she was having a stress-induced hallucination. Then I looked at Patricia Johnson, cowering behind the melted surveyor's equipment with tears streaming down her face. "A demonstration," I said. "Show them what happens to those who profit from destroying the land, but spare the ones who are just following orders. Let them carry the message back." The war chief considered this for a long moment. Around us, the other 6 riders sat motionless on their skeletal horses, waiting for his decision. The only sound was the crackling of electrical energy from their spears and the distant rumble of thunder. "Very well," he said finally. "But if they return, if they continue their plans to wound the earth, then all will pay the price." He raised his spear and lightning split the sky again. When my vision cleared, Patricia Johnson was gone, not dead, but vanished completely, leaving only a pile of ash where she'd been standing. A message to her company, written in a language they'd understand. Williams was on her knees, sobbing and clutching her briefcase. "This isn't real," she kept saying. "This can't be real." The war chief leaned down from his horse and spoke directly to her. "Tell your superiors what you have seen. Tell them the earth has protectors who will not be bought or intimidated. Tell them some debts can only be paid in blood." Then they were gone, vanishing into the ligs, lightning as suddenly as they'd appeared. Williams and I were alone with the smoking remains of the surveyor's equipment and Steve Chen's body. It took me 4 hours to get Williams back to the ranger station. She spent most of the trip in shock, muttering about impossible things and environmental protection. But by the time we reached civilization, something had changed in her eyes. A new understanding, maybe, or a new fear. She never filed her report. The mining permits were quietly withdrawn. The companies involved suddenly found other projects to pursue. Within a month, the entire Panther Creek area was declared off-limits to resource extraction, protected by federal legislation that passed Congress with unusual speed. But the NVI weren't finished hunting. Over the next 6 months, 13 more people died. Mining executives, logging company owners, federal officials who tried to overturn the environmental protections. Each death was ruled natural: heart attacks, accidents, freak lightning strikes. But I knew better. The Ghost Riders were expanding their territory, moving beyond the national forest to hunt anyone involved in environmental destruction. They appeared during Senate hearings, manifesting in the middle of corporate boardrooms, riding through city streets during thunderstorms that came from nowhere. The media called it the Green Terror, environmentalists gone militant. The FBI launched a massive investigation looking for a terrorist cell that didn't exist. Meanwhile, industrial companies quietly began changing their practices, pulling out of environmentally sensitive areas, funding restoration projects they'd opposed for decades. Fear, as the war chief had said, was a powerful teacher, but I knew it couldn't continue. The NVI were spirits of justice, not vengeance. Their campaign of terror was necessary to get attention, to force change, but it had to end before it consumed everything in its path. I called Aunt Mary again, asking her about Cherokee ceremonies for communicating with spirits. She was reluctant at first. Some knowledge was too dangerous to share. But when I explained what was happening, she agreed to help. The ceremony took place at the scattered Cherokee stones in the old logging site. Aunt Mary came down from the reservation with 3 other tribal elders, bringing sage and sweetgrass and prayers in the old language. We built a fire as the sun set and waited for the spirits to arrive. They came with the first rumble of thunder, 7 pale riders appearing out of the gathering storm. But this time, they dismounted, standing around our fire like living men instead of supernatural hunters. In the firelight, I could see they wore the clothes and weapons of Cherokee warriors from different eras, some from before white contact, others from the Trail of Tears, still others from more recent times. "You called us," the war chief said. "Why?" Aunt Mary stepped forward, speaking in Cherokee. I couldn't understand all the words, but the tone was respectful, formal, the language of diplomacy rather than challenge. She was acknowledging their grievances, recognizing their right to seek justice, but also asking them to consider mercy. The war chief listened in silence, then responded in English so I could understand. "For generations, we watched our lands destroyed, our people driven away, Our sacred places turned into mines and clear-cuts. We asked for justice through your courts, your laws, your political systems. Nothing changed. But it is changing now, I said. The companies are pulling out. Congress is passing new environmental laws. You've gotten their attention. Through fear. Yes. But now you need to show them a path to redemption. Give them a chance to make things right. Another of the riders spoke up, a younger warrior with paint on his face. They had their chance. They chose greed. Some did, I agreed, but not all. There are people trying to protect the land, trying to undo the damage. If you kill everyone involved in environmental issues, you'll end up killing the people who might help. The war chief studied me with those burning eyes. What do you propose? A treaty. You stop the killing, they stop the destruction. Genuine environmental protection, real restoration of damaged areas, and respect for Cherokee sacred sites. Give them a chance to prove they can change. And if they break this treaty, I met his gaze. Then you resume the hunt. The spirits conferred among themselves in Cherokee, their voices mixing with the wind and the crackle of the fire. Finally, the war chief nodded. We will try your way, but we will be watching. And if they return to their old ways, they won't, I said, hoping I was right. The treaty was never written down, never signed by politicians or corporate executives. It existed in the silence that followed, in the sudden absence of environmental disasters and industrial accidents. Companies that had fought environmental protection for decades suddenly became model citizens, funding cleanup projects and restoration efforts. A few tried to backslide, to return to their old practices when they thought the attention had moved elsewhere. Patricia Johnson's company attempted to resume strip mining operations in West Virginia 6 months later. She was found dead in her hotel room, struck by lightning that somehow came through the walls without damaging anything else. The message was clear. The treaty was still in effect. I stayed on as a ranger for another 15 years, becoming something of an unofficial liaison between the corporate world and the spirits that watched over the forest. Companies would call me before starting new projects, asking for guidance on how to avoid environmental complications. I'd ride out to the proposed sites, looking for signs of Cherokee presence, checking for sacred stones or burial grounds that weren't on any official maps. Most of the time, I never saw the NV Equa directly, but I knew they were there, watching from the shadows, ready to ride again, if the treaty was broken. Sometimes during thunderstorms, I'd catch glimpses of pale riders moving through the trees, patrolling their territory like ghostly sentinels. Thunder died in 1997, old age taking him peacefully in his pasture. At his funeral, yes, I held a funeral for a horse, 7 riders appeared at the edge of the forest, their heads bowed in respect. They understood loyalty, these spirits. They understood the bond between partners who'd faced the impossible together. I retired in 1999, but I still live in the mountains, in a cabin not far from Panther Creek. On clear nights, when the wind is right, I can sometimes hear hoofbeats in the distance. The sound of the NV Equa, still riding, still watching, still ready to collect the debts that mortals try to ignore. The environmental movement calls it the Great Awakening, the sudden corporate shift toward sustainability that happened in the mid-1980s. Historians credit changing public opinion, economic pressure, and far-sighted leadership. They're not entirely wrong, but they're missing the most important part of the story. Sometimes change comes through legislation and negotiation. Sometimes it comes through education and public pressure. And sometimes, when all else fails, it comes riding out of a thunderstorm on horses made of lightning and bone, carrying spears that can split the sky and hearts that remember every injustice. The earth has protectors. They're patient, but they're not powerless, and they never forget. Some debts, as the war chief told me that first day, can only be paid in blood. But mercy exists for those who truly repent, who genuinely work to heal the damage they've caused. The choice, as always, belongs to us. The NV Equa are still riding, still watching, still waiting to see which path we'll choose. I just pray we choose wisely.